Hey man,
Hello, Tim.
how's it going?
Going okay. Made the mistake of taking a little peek at the news, trying to comprehend what's happening to my country. But
Uh,
much rather talk to you about prehension. It's a
hmm.
nice escape from the political chaos.
Yeah, no,
I mean, these ideas matter, but probably they matter for like the long view of the evolution of human consciousness 1,000 years hence, rather than to what's happening right now.
yeah, I don't know how to respond to that cold. Maybe we'll get somewhere with that. I like to think, of course, that this, thinking about ontology, I mean, analogously, but sort of moving us out of the hot water of the current political landscape.
I didn't want us to dwell there. I was just being honest about what I was just doing
Yeah.
before we're jumping on here.
I mean, I'm asked kind of, I guess, all the time how these, how sort of speculative ontology interacts with, empirical science and why I should, if people want to put me into a box and they're like, oh, you're an evolutionary biologist, why should you care about this? Or what difference does this make in the lab or whatever? And I mean, I do think it makes a big difference, actually, but I think that can be also one of the things that makes it vague in a way is that that can be very difficult to put your finger on before you've done the work. So, before you've developed the speculative ontology and then tried, and then of course done the work of reconnecting it to some very local context.
Right.
But I think one thing we might get to when we're going through this Hartshorne article is this local global thing, which has come up. How do we understand relationships between the local and global? Do we begin with the global and assume that the local is in conformity with it, or do we go the other way? And so when we talk about symmetry and Hartshorne's comments on symmetry in both in Whitehead and in Hume and elsewhere, maybe that's something that we'll talk about.
Yeah.
But I think the ontology side of things, it has a kind of blue sky aspect to it in terms of its relationship to the research, in that we don't necessarily know how it's going to impact the research without doing the work. And of course, part of the problem then is once you get into the weeds with the speculative ontology, it's like, oh, okay, this is never ending, this
Right.
work. And so how am I going to sort of stipulatively bring it back into a sort of more empirical research context
Right.
without kind of imagining that I've completed the speculative work in some way. So can I
Yeah.
can I put it? Can I say, okay, well, I've reached this point. It's very much not complete, but I need a kind of closure at this point in order to test the hypothesis, let's say.
Mm.
Um, and then can I then return to the ontology given the result? It should be in that kind of,
Yeah.
pretty
I'm
standard.
exaggerating a little bit by saying that,
Yeah.
the concept of prehension isn't really figuring that out isn't really going to change anything for 1,000 years. I'm exaggerating, but Hartshorne goes through in this article on Whitehead's revolutionary concept of prehension, these 16 habits of thought that are thousands of years in the making. And he
Yeah.
thinks those 16 habits of thought, and I don't think he's claiming that that's an exhaustive list or anything, but um, that's why it took 2,500 years to invent a concept that he feels, and I tend to agree, is so useful and elucidating. And so that, it can take so long for
Yeah.
ideas to ingress in the course of the evolution of human consciousness and the history of philosophy, I think shows that metaphysics is obviously an ongoing process of inquiry, and we're never going to finish or complete this project. But it takes many minds working over many years to actually think clearly about our common sense experience.
And then we have to mistrust that clarity.
Sure. Yeah, yeah. That's a trigger word. Sorry. Clarity. To think clearly um, about vagueness too, though. To think,
Yeah, no, I'm being slightly facetious, but also not, because in some sense, there's nothing more dangerous than thinking that you've understood something really clearly. Um, but yeah, I mean, so what Hartson is talking about there is partly it's kind of like conceptual inertia, right? That our way of thinking has been framed or formed over such a long period of time by all these concepts that we will need to get into, and not just tease any listeners by saying, oh, there are these, we'll get into them. Uh, they have created an arena, set of catalyzing constraints, blah, 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 for the development of our thought over a very long period of time. And then it becomes really difficult to unpick that. And then again, we're in this situation where, maybe one derives this notion of prehension, and it makes an immediate difference perhaps in your lived experience. Suddenly you understand things very differently, and it starts to transform things, and you feel that it transforms your relationships, and maybe it does transform your empirical work as a scientist and all of that sort of stuff, or your perspective on these things. But then it's very different. Still, you have to try to transfer, transduce that into some kind of like transpersonal or transindividual impact. How are
Mhm.
you going to translate from too many lots of trans words here from your own, the transformative effect that it's had on your own perspective? How are and as soon as you try to insert that into a more collective context, you're right butting up against all this conceptual inertia of the last however long.
Right.
Uh, and
Yeah.
that becomes the real difficulty. So you could transform something very rapidly on a very local scale, but again, transforming the political landscape or something like that with a concept
Yeah.
of prehension, you can be in a situation where, I don't know, a lot of people were in the 60s, turn on, tune in, drop out, just take this, miraculous substance and you'll see the light. And if only everybody saw things the way that I do, wow, that would resolve all my adaptive conflicts, wouldn't it? Because everyone would see things the way that I do, and we'd all just get along and sing kumbaya together and all of that. And that tends to be that's the danger of clarity. If only everybody saw things in the way that I do, uh,
Right.
wouldn't the world be a much better place? But again, it's also that there's a disconnect when it comes to, even if you were correct about that, how are you gonna I mean, I'm always going to say enforce, but how are you going to induce or influence people to think the way you are? And of course, we know there are many ways that people try to do that, and maybe the current political landscape is a reflection of people who think that they really understand some shit, trying to enforce that understanding on others. And
Yeah.
we know how horribly wrong that can go. So mistrust clarity in that sense, right? If you think you've seen through a very, very complex issue, like some major factor in cultural evolution and why we're having all of these issues with polarization and blah, 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 associated with a certain kind of cultural progress, we might say, well, maybe you haven't understood that, and maybe it's dangerous to believe that you have, and you should mistrust your own simplifying assumption. We're going to talk a lot about simplifying assumptions, I think. If
Yeah.
we connect the Hartshorne article with other things we talk about, free energy principle, maybe even your conversation with Ruth Kastner, all of
Mm.
that stuff, simplifying assumptions. How do we
Right.
avoid how do we avoid tacitly reifying our own simplifying assumptions?
Hmm. Yeah. I mean, just hopefully we'll get through all 16, but we'll see. But number three is one of these habits of thought that Hartshorne thinks has blocked us from the, uh, I would say, the insight into the nature of vagueness that prehension provides us as a concept. Um, is he thinks the over reliance on common sense and ordinary language.
Mm.
And, Whitehead says metaphysics is experimentation on the instrument of language itself. And so we're trying to be persuasive in our use of um, a novel phraseology so that the eventually ordinary language will come along for the ride, and an experiment will then become a new habit that we'll have to overcome. Um, and so I think that emphasis on the role of metaphysics in transforming the current language, but also always remaining suspicious of its own novel formulations, which themselves end up, yeah, becoming canalized habits that could impede further progress, right? And so progress, indefinite progress, it doesn't need to be progress to a fixed end that we already know in advance, but progress in the sense of creative advance.
Yeah.
Um,
We'll need to talk about the predefinition of the state space, of the space of possibility and all of that. And I actually, as you would know, I really enjoy Hartshorne's kind of
Mhm.
criticisms of Whitehead, and the way they resonate with his criticisms of determinism. And Hartshorne really nails determinism here in like very, very lucidly, very I think that's like problem no
So,
number four,
oh,
right? It's about
well,
symmetry.
and yeah, six is
Six is
reference back to four. Yeah.
determinism, but I think when he gets to that, he says, this has already been dealt with in number four. But I like how in a few of the places, including nominalism, number 15, he talks
Mm.
about the way that Whitehead is uncomfortably close to some of these doctrines. And that's certainly, I think, as you know, resonates with some of my concerns about Whitehead. But I think before we get too deep into the weeds there, so we've read, Charles Hartshorne on Whitehead's concept of Whitehead on prehension is the article, and you've been writing about. I mean, obviously Whitehead is your bag, but you've been writing specifically about prehension, and you've said this was an article that you found really interesting. So I guess, do you want to give a kind of précis of your understanding of prehension, and then we go through Hartshorne?
Sure. Um, well, as Hartshorne says, this concept requires an imaginative leap and a willingness to embrace a kind of anthropomorphic analogical reasoning, which in the modern period in particular, anthropomorphism became one of the main habits of thought that modern critical rationality wanted to overcome, or in Kant's sense, at least recognize and say can't be overcome, but uh, in some sense. But anthropomorphism here is acknowledging that there's as Peirce would say, some continuity between mind and nature, and prehension is an attempt to generalize what we know as human beings as feeling, or what we know as experience as such that it applies to all natural events, all physical processes. And so that causality itself can be understood as the transmission of feelings from one event to another event. And the, the imaginative leap comes here with, I think, where I see a lot of people have hit a stumbling block with prehension is they can't imagine what non-conscious experience might be, what might be meant by that. Um, because a lot of people use consciousness in a way that's kind of loose enough that it's just synonymous with experience. And I think if we can understand what a non-conscious experience might be, and examples would include like the our moods, that we're not if we're not necessarily attending in a self-reflective, psychological sense to our own moods, then that's clearly a kind of feeling that's in the background of our conscious attention. And there are all sorts of things on the fringes of our conscious attention that we would not want to say are totally lacking in any sense of you know, uh, experiential quality, because they can get our attention all of a sudden. And we notice after the fact that we were already experiencing it, but we just weren't conscious of it. So anyways, I think that seems to be a stumbling block for people. But just to give a little bit of the sense of what's the technical details of prehension, is it's what allows, um, in its physical form, physical prehension, it's what allows the past to remain present without being identical to the present, right? And so it's a relationship, um, that allows for the past to become data for the present, and not data that is determining the present, but that is nonetheless a necessary condition for the present. And as Hartshorne specifies, it's not a sufficient condition for the present, because then again, cause and effect would be identical. Past and present would be identical, right? And so prehension allows us to establish there's an asymmetrical relationship between the past and the present, even if the present still remains internally related to the past. So I'm already getting into the weeds and the technicalities there, but I think I needed to put some of that on the table.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah, no, I think yeah, no, that was great. And I want to jump to what is it, problem 12 in a second, the pathetic anthropomorphic fallacy, because of the way you introduced it. But I think one thing that I said, even you sent me a passage from Process and Reality this morning, which I'm sorry to say that I haven't memorized, but uh, what struck me about that passage in particular, and I mean it's kind of it's an obvious thing to say about Whitehead's whole approach, but I think it's that the doctrine of prehension does, and I just want to see how this sort of lands with you. It's Whitehead's attempt to simultaneously solve the problem of causation that Hume, like on the problem of induction, basically, that Hume, the way Hume left us with it. So precisely why is there a continuity between the past and the future, or the present and the future, such that we can make inductive judgments, and such that probability, in fact, is real. And Hartshorne talks about how the fact that probability should be a central concern for philosophy, which I agree with. Um, and also simultaneously to solve the problem of affect, right? So, in a sense, I don't know if you would say to solve the hard problem of consciousness or whatever, but in a way, with these two different forms of prehension, and I guess we'll talk about the relationship between them, like
mhm.
physical and conceptual prehension, but and the reliance on this conceptualizer or prehender, whose name we will not invoke at this juncture, but no doubt we will later. That yeah, I mean, does that seem like a reasonable characterization that he's trying to solve both the problem of causation and, in a sense, the problem of affect, like showing how affect, so valence, value, um,
Mhm.
and relevance, are
Yeah.
through this single doctrine are kind of simultaneously solved, and we can show, yes, there's a continuity between the past, present, and future. That's the important thing for us to be able to show, and at the same time, we can show that affects and everything that goes with that is part of nature, and is kind of a is
Yeah.
uh,
There's an asymmetrical continuity between past, present, and future. And um, I wouldn't say Whitehead so much solves the hard problem as dissolves it because, there is no such thing as the detached mind. There's no such thing as physical process that's not already prehensive. Um,
No,
and
that's a very important gloss, and I mean, of course, I would like it to be said that way, in the sense that I'm always saying that I reject the hard problem, in the sense because that's a particular branding.
Right.
It has,
Yeah. I think it's an important, Chalmers does us a favor by framing it to make clear, the stakes if we're going to accept a materialist ontology. Um, but ultimately, we need to step back from having arrived at that hard problem and reframe the situation that is leading us to inquire.
I think just to be clear on this again, and I know I've said it before in our discussions, but whenever I say this, someone jumps up and is like, "This is, what on earth are you talking about?" Um, Chalmers basically, and it's a long time since I've read that paper, but I've read it the first paper, the original, I think it's 1994, maybe it's 1996, but the original formulation of the hard,
95 paper, 96 book, I think, but
yeah, it's in,
memory is, yeah.
yeah, it's in there. It's in there. Um, where I think it's where he introduces the term the hard problem, and he formulates the hard problem. And
Mhm.
essentially, he says that it's not amenable to a mechanistic explanation, it's not
Mhm.
amenable to a functional explanation, but nonetheless, it's a problem for science. And I basically would just say that that's a kind of an incoherent
Yeah.
um, formulation, because
Yeah.
what you're rightly pointing to, what's rightly being pointed to, is that this is a problem in the ontology. So the mechanical philosophy has a hard problem of consciousness, but he doesn't get into that. He just says science has to deal with this, but then he takes all the ways that science, as sort of traditionally defined in the modern era, have the kind of explanatory purchase that science has on the world. He says, no, 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 you can't have any of that, but I want you to solve it anyway. And I'm like,
Yeah.
that to me, that's an incoherent formulation. And that's why I kind of reject the hard problem of consciousness in a
That's
nutshell.
fair.
Yeah.
That's fair. Um, yeah, I'm tempted to talk about Whitehead's bifurcation of nature in his early work in his philosophy of science and how he defines nature as um, what we are aware of in perception, so
Mhm.
including sensory qualities just as much as measurable quantities. It's all part of what we're aware of in our perception of nature. Um, and he says that mind or consciousness can't be a problem for science to address because science presupposes it. We're not aware of that in perception. That's, the question of who's knowing nature can't come up for science in a wide sense. But that's just a different way of, it's an alternative to a way of framing the problem to the one that leaves us with the hard problem because we're not assuming a mechanistic picture of nature denuded of anything qualitative. Um, but just to go back to prehension, I
Yeah.
yeah, it's solving a variety of problems with one fell swoop, from causality to perception to memory to the fact value divide. I mean, it's really it cuts through all of these problems. And so, it's an extraordinary generalization, as Hartshorne says.
Mm.
And
Mhm.
I do think, you know, I think Hartshorne's right to point out some of the other issues with Whitehead's metaphysics that say Peirce figures out in a more satisfying way. But he's very clear that prehension and associated ideas like the becoming of continuity, Whitehead's pluralism, rather than the continuity of becoming, that he thinks Peirce and Bergson get that wrong. Um, and I think prehension is part of how Whitehead establishes that sense of becoming or actual occasions as atomic in some sense, that there's sort of undivided wholeness um, about these occasions of experience that make them what is really concrete, and the continuity is established as a result of the prehension, the prehensive relations among those concrete entities. Um, so, yeah, that's all to say. Whether or not we accept this extraordinary generalization, I think is um, it's at the core of what Whitehead has really contributed to philosophy. And we can jettison eternal objects. It's not such a new idea, really. It's as old as philosophy, but prehension, that's new, and I think that's Hartshorne is right to really emphasize
Mm.
the significance of this concept. Um,
Yeah, it's a concept that I quite like. Obviously, I do have some of Hartshorne's issues with other aspects of Whitehead's philosophy, which we'll get into, and the way they articulate with prehension, perhaps. And then, of course, I have differences with some of the things that Hartshorne wants to say as well. But
mm,
he says, what does he say? He basically says that prehension is an unprecedented theory of creativity, and only vague approximations to it can be found in Buddhism, Peirce, or
right.
Bergson. And those are the particular kind of precursors that he
Mm,
discusses kind of what they get right and what they get wrong. And interestingly, he interprets dependent co-arising in Buddhism as an occasionalist doctrine, in the same sense that you've just described Whitehead's, in the sense that there are these, concrete, the final concrete entities, actual occasions are these indivisible wholes. Um, yeah. So I think, we'll get into all this, and I think we'll jump back and forth in on the list of problems, because essentially I suppose Hartshorne is saying that, there's this list of 16 issues, and they are why, as we discussed, it took 2,500 years, whatever, since Plato, I guess, to come up with the doctrine of prehension. And I think we'll and also, I mean, I don't know if he's quite saying that prehension solves them all. Um, he's saying that they're a barrier to the derivation of this concept, and then he also talks about ones where he's more or less satisfied with Peirce. So I'm sorry, with Whitehead and with Peirce, though. So there are some things that a number of these issues he felt he was already getting along with very well before Whitehead, and he
that's
certainly
great.
is again signaling Peirce and Bergson as particular, um, mighty ancestors in this case. But then there are particular ones that Whitehead was integral to his own
Right.
understanding. But I wanted,
We should say the Husserl or Hartshorne, Yeah, he studied with Husserl before he went to Harvard and then was an assistant of Whitehead's while he was also editing Peirce's papers, right? So he's steeped in Peirce's thought and I think is uniquely positioned to see as they saw and to see the differences and similarities between Whitehead and Peirce here. Yeah.
Yeah, it makes him a really fascinating figure. And I think we'll get to number 8, where he specifically critiques Persson and Bergson in,
Mhm.
I think, exactly the manner you were just talking about in terms of continuity. Um,
Oh,
but
and let me just say one more thing about Buddhism.
oh yeah.
Obviously, there's so much internal diversity within,
Mm.
thousands of years of different Buddhist schools of thought. But I think what the particular thing he has in mind, I think, would be the Abhidharma school, which has this notion of a dharma, which, I mean, dharma has so many meanings in Sanskrit, but in this case, it refers to this kind of psychophysical, momentary, like fleeting existence, very much like an actual occasion. And there's some other like 70 some odd dharmas that are phenomenologically distinguished by this Abhidharma school, different types of occasions of experience. So it's not exactly like, I mean, obviously it's not exactly like Whitehead. There's no identity here, but there is something similar. The idea of the dependent origination, co-origination of all these dharmas is there. But interestingly, I'm not an expert in this, but I have a close friend of mine who's a Buddhist scholar who's always helping me avoid referring vaguely to Buddhism because there's Buddhisms, you know.
Yeah,
Um, the Mahayana traditions would critique the Abhidharma tradition for having this residue of substantialist thinking because of this kind of atomism in Whitehead's sense, you know. And so a lot of interesting, there's so much we could learn from the history of Buddhist philosophy and on this issue. But nonetheless, it's a perfectly, fine comparison to make. Whitehead makes it himself.
yeah, no, that's a really fascinating clarification for sure, because certainly it was my reaction to what Hartshorne had written, that again, that may describe certain Buddhist perspectives, but that's not exhaustive. This atomic perspective, this occasionalist perspective, basically on dependent
Mhm.
co-origination, is not really. It's not there. It's not. That's not generically implied by dependent
Right.
co-origination.
Right.
That that atomic structure of it. Anyway, so we jump back because it was one of the most important things you said about prehension and people's difficulties with prehension, and the so number 12 of these 16 issues, and I think we're just going to jump back and forth in them. And obviously, anyone who really wants to see the whole 60, we're not going to cover all of them. So anyone who wants to see them, just download the paper. I'm sure Matt will provide a link, and you can scan the list pretty easily. And it's a very short paper, and it's very worth. It's really interesting. It's short, but it's very juicy, as I like to say. There's a lot of stuff to chew on, and I think I would probably be revisiting it. But yeah, number 12 is, and again, these are the concepts that are limiting for the history of Western philosophy, that have prevented anyone having this great insight of prehension that Hartshorne is attributing to Whitehead. So the 12th fallacy basically is, well, it's the accusation of anthropomorphism. It's the designation of anthropomorphism as a fallacy, and he refers to it as the pathetic anthropomorphic fallacy. And he says in his elaboration on that, he says the only pathetic fallacy that is demonstrably so is the attribution of specifically human feelings to non-human creatures, and the idea of prehension is infinitely more abstract and general than the idea of human feelings. So just planting a flag. Okay, do we want to generalize the term feeling and experience for something that is infinitely more abstract? That's a lot more abstract and a lot more.
Uh-huh.
Um, so even as an ape does not have human feelings, and again, we might even problematize like which human feelings are we talking about? Um, uh, but clearly there is an analogy, okay, that I would of course completely agree with. And I think that the analogy holds, I would agree the analogy holds across the whole infinitely abstract and general spectrum of prehension, but there are devils in the details. Prehension is the extreme generalization of this analogy. Cool. The more imaginative power one has, the more sense one can have of the difference between the specifically human, whoops, um, the specifically human and the generic meaning of feeling. Now, I have a kind of an issue with this kind of phrasing. This is very like this rhetorical phrasing that he uses there. The more imaginative power one has. Okay, so basically, if you disagree with me and my preferred generalization of terms, that's because you lack the imaginative power. Yeah, don't like that kind of phrasing. That's, speaking.
Whitehead says it's an imaginative leap, and so you could say you're unwilling to take the imaginative leap because you don't think it's worth the risk, which, fair enough.
But maybe you can take the imaginative leap fully, and spend some time in that space where you fully agree, even during a particular moment of experience or an extended period of experience, and then you might still back off and say, "Well, I've had that imagination, and I'm not willing to enshrine." Like I can take all kinds of imaginative leaps, let's say, right? But I don't necessarily enshrine them all in my positive ontology or in my choice of terminology. Let's say there's a different things, right? And I just that kind of phrasing is always a little bit irksome, and it's a little bit like, I obviously facetiously referenced it with like psychedelic movements at the beginning, but contemplative philosophies are always saying this kind of thing as well. Look, if you would just meditate for at least 20 minutes a day, but preferably 2 hours, 7 days, blah, 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 then you would see the world the way that I do. Well, that's not an argument, actually. That's pure rhetoric. And so then just to finish this number 12, because there's another thing that slightly irritates me. Yeah, again, even though I'm sympathetic to the actual philosophical content here. And then he says an infant does not have human feelings other than the merely sensory, if human means closely like those of adults. Well, it doesn't, in my opinion. That's not the way that I use the term human. Um,
Mhm.
I'm a biologist. Human is like a species being, and that might be different than person as well. So, like my dog might be a person, but isn't a human. Um,
Yeah.
but infants are humans, and I also think it's still under, and I mean, I've got a 3-year-old daughter, so just having been through 3 years, it's still underrated by a lot of like, and it's pernicious in my opinion, the way yes, of course, infants have don't have the range of experience that adults do, right? They have a different range of experience. But people say things like, if your child smiles at you before it's like 3 months old or whatever they say, it's really just because it's got gas, like infants don't imitate facial expressions or don't partake of a kind of shared resonant emotional, communication through body language until they reach a certain age. Personally, I think that's total BS. And
I would
having
assume Hartshorne agrees, and because Whitehead specifically gives a mother's relationship to the child as an example of prehension occurring, and so I'm
oh yeah,
sure he
yeah,
agrees with you.
yeah. But yeah, I don't think Hudson would deny that there's prehension occurring, because there's prehension, going on in the transactional interpretation of quantum mechanics, as you were just talking about with Ruth the other day. So prehension is completely generic. The question is whether it's like human, and whether
Yeah.
it's, how. I'm only being, a little bit. I don't
I
even
don't
know.
like his rhetoric in that paragraph either, to be, so I agree with you there, but I think there are better arguments for the analogy being made here than the way he's phrasing it there.
I think so, definitely. I think we don't. I think it's obfuscatory almost, or it becomes and this is I think the generic problem that people do have. So it's not just the pathetic anthropomorphic fallacy, as Hartshorne identifies it, that prevent people from going all the way with, say, prehension, or the
Mhm.
conflation of prehension, if one can understand that as infinitely more abstract and general than human feeling. But there's still a terminological conflation of prehension with feeling, and with experience as well. So hence we get this pan-experientialist
Yeah.
doctrine. And I think, well, this rhetoric, as articulated here, is somehow related to that generalizing of terms. And
Mm.
maybe we don't need to generalize those terms in
No,
that way. Maybe
I
that
think we
becomes.
can, yeah, we can be more abstract about it, like Whitehead, and Hartshorne repeats the same terminology Whitehead uses here, that prehension is a reference to the how of experience, not a reference to the what of experience, which would imply that a conscious experience
Yeah.
of what is being experienced. which can make that can a how like a prehension that's unconscious, um, which is the how can later become a what when we reflect on or remember it. But again, this is that distinction between like say conscious knowledge or cognitive experience and non-conscious prehension. And I think that distinction between the how of experience and what is being experienced is a better way, more generic but abstract way of talking about how
Yeah.
prehension is not like conscious experience.
Yeah, no, I think that that's right. And so just to be clear, I accept the analogy and think it's a really important analogy. And I think that we should be able to make principled analogies from, say, our lived experience to more generic ontological categories. I think we have to, right? So that I completely agree with. I think it just doesn't follow from the fact that there is this analogy that we either generalize certain terms
Sure.
or even certain properties. And so, on the one hand, I think he's not generalizing certain properties enough when he's denying the ape certain human experiences or saying that the infant doesn't have human experiences. What all I mean is, I guess what I'm trying to get at, and maybe I'm not being very clear, is that this generalization reveals its ad hoc nature in precisely this
Yeah.
place.
Yeah.
His opinion, it's just an opinion that apes do or don't have these experiences. It's just an opinion and it's an unnecessary rhetorical and ad hoc gloss of more of the general category of prehension, and that might not just be Hartshorne. That might be there in Whitehead too, right? This is one of my issues with Whitehead, as you know.
Mhm.
So I agree again with the operator. So the analogy in the sort of Simondonian way that he talks about operational analogies, I agree that the operator of prehension is a good one, but I think that the way certain terms and properties associated with that operation are generalized or indeed not generalized in this particular passage is ad hoc. And so I feel quite free, in fact, to reject and again, maybe I'm just justifying that for myself if you want, but I feel quite free to reject, say, pan-experientialism as a doctrine, even if I would accept pan-prehensionism.
Right. I think that comment about the human and the infant not being human as we normally mean it, quote unquote human, he must mean something like self-reflective consciousness or something, which later, I mean, in several of his books, Whitehead's very clear that consciousness is kind of a derivative sideshow, and it's not to be made the central protagonist of metaphysics as Descartes or Kant do, um, and so there's definitely um, a decentering and anthrodecentric, as it were, gesture in the philosophy of organism, and I think whether or not we use the word like feeling your criticism is totally fair there. I think prehension makes it clear that we're talking about something, if not infinitely abstract, then at least as generic as we could get. And similarly with experience, I like it because I'm a, I've read a lot of William James and love his way of talking about pure experience, in a psychological way, but Whitehead cosmologizes that, and I just rhetorically, I the wheels are greased, and I like to go in that direction, I guess. But I
Yeah.
understand the resistance to it because it can be misleading. Because a lot of people hear that and think we're talking about, atoms making conscious deliberations about what to do next.
Again, it's just whether in at the level of the speculative ontology, this is something we just get to all the time. It's sort of when you're doing the diagrammatic thing, you want to choose those terms, I think, really carefully to avoid, putting too much garb on them, which ends up obfuscating what you're actually really trying to talk about here. And so that's the only thing that I'm highlighting, and again highlighting that it is ad hoc and personal the way we choose to generalize some of those terms, as in it is not intrinsic to the logical structure here. It's not intrinsic to the operational schema. So you can choose to do that, obviously, but there are certain costs and benefits of making that kind of choice. And the thing is, I really like the notion of pure experience, and I like it in Buddhist context, and I like it in Nishida, and yeah, like this is to me that's a real experience. Um, but that's quite different again from generalizing it into the speculative ontology, right?
Yeah.
Um,
I think this is about how we translate metaphysics into common language.
yeah,
And
yeah.
so that's a strategic decision about how we want this, or if we want it to, if and how we want it to affect the broader culture versus just being engaged in the technical enterprise of, speculative metaphysics and developing a maximally neutral, diagrammatic language to describe.
So I think if people are going to engage to the extent that is required in order to understand the operational schema, you may as well say, prehension is the general category and feeling is a specific manifestation of that. And then you're getting everything you want from it. You're grounding feeling in nature and in a general category and all of that. But you are not synonymizing them in a way that becomes, I believe, and again, it's like it's a judgment call, it's ad hoc. I believe it becomes a barrier to, it's why we get people who are otherwise very sympathetic to, say, Whitehead's operational schema, or many aspects of it, maybe not all of them, saying that his terminology is a liability in science and things like that. And I mean, I know where they're coming from. Again, I don't think we need to generalize the terms in precisely that way. So what I'm wary of here, and because I think we're going to get there as well, is the kind of rhetorical position that says, if you like this aspect of my philosophy or this philosophy, you need to take the whole thing on board, right? And that if you excised the eternal objects as I have defined them, or as Whitehead has defined them, then you would be destroying, yes, of course, Whitehead's system is very coherent, and that's one of its great values. But nonetheless, you can still change aspects of it and preserve other. And so I don't like the argument that you find, I feel, in both Peirce and White. Peirce's argument, like in the neglected argument and elsewhere, he will say things like, "So you like my logic? In that case, you believe in God. In that case, you believe in my God, because none of this makes sense without God. And it's a conflation of the personal and the diagrammatic, or it's a conflation of the what I call the prosaic and the speculative. And that kind of move, I have a generic difficulty with. Um,
That's the
because
Christological move, just have to say. But yeah, I
yeah,
mean,
no,
right?
sure. Sure, yeah, 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 I have concerns. You know very well that I have concerns about that. But let's not get bogged down in that right now. I just thought this was the anthropomorphic fallacy, because it's all about how we generate, like, how do we engage in anthropomorphism? It's not about so dismissing any kind of anthropomorphic reasoning to court is clearly not the way to go. But there are certain, naive anthropomorphisms that we do want to restrict.
Yeah.
But and there are other aspects that we feel like we really should generalize. And our choices there will live and die. Hopefully, no, they probably won't actually. They'll probably live and die by the rhetoric. But ideally, they would live and die by the strength of the operational schema that we would derive by making those analogies. Um,
Yeah, got to read the sophist and the statesman and figure out the
yeah,
difference between the sophist and the philosopher, rhetoric and truth. But
yeah.
you know, um,
Well, doesn't that become an irreconcilable difference at the end of the sophist? Because
well, yeah, exactly. Um,
do
mm, yeah, um, I forget where I wanted to go with that.
you want to jump into another of the 16 issues? Your choice.
Yeah, so. Oh, I know what I was going to say. With regard to, I mean, I referred to this pathetic anthropomorphic fallacy as anthropophobia,
Uh, yeah,
which is like the danger there. There's two extremes that are both dangerous. Um, if you're so concerned about anthropomorphism, that you don't allow any kind of analogy, then you kind of become anthropocentric,
yeah,
right? In the sense that you're saying only human beings have
yeah.
consciousness or perception or memory or whatever the
And then
experiential quality is.
Descartes telling students you can operate on animals because they're just machines and the screams are like the sound of steam being let off or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah, so obviously we want to avoid, pathetic anthropomorphism, but we also want to avoid anthropocentrism, and holding the balance there, holding the tension between those extremes, I think is really, really important here. Um, I mean, maybe the idea of number 11, the idea of mind as um, inextended or unextended would be a logical place to go next.
Yeah.
Um, because Hartshorne has a lot of interesting things to say about the nature of space. If we adopt Whitehead's process relational ontology, that space itself um, becomes a nexus of relationships or prehensive relations. Um, was his exact phrase? I really liked it. It was that space is an order of relations, and minds can have these relations. Um,
Yeah. Then mind can in principle explain reality.
which is an interesting idealist move. I mean, I think Hartshorne's a bit more of an idealist, like than Whitehead would be, but
Well, I think that can be read in two different ways, right? The
mhm.
one way is saying that you know, because we are again, it's this is exactly this issue. It is very much a rational place to go after number 12, even though despite the order. Because one way it's about how do we generalize. So one way is saying that we are part of, we're constituted from the same set of operations, let's say, not necessarily to say the same stuff. Um, as space, if space is a network of relations, that's our lived experience, or our mind is constituted of a network of relations as well, and thus, because we're basically part of the same, continuum in a qualified sense, discontinuous continuum, we can under it can be a ontology turned into an epistemological argument. We do have the capacity to understand this thing because we are in fact of the same
Mhm.
nature as that thing, right? The
Yeah.
other thing could be the more hardcore idealist move, which is saying that because we can see this sort of operational equivalence here, we can see this relational principle and how it is consistent across the two domains. And traditionally, we think of mind in this way. We think of mind in terms of these relations. We're revealing, like Whitehead is revealing to us, that space can be thought of in the same way. Therefore, mind is the fundamental category of reality, right? So everything else is mental because the analogy originally derives from the mental, and then that gets turned into a hard metaphysical thesis about the priority of, and is that what you mean by the
Y-
idealist move?
Yeah, exactly. And I don't like that extra comment he adds, then mind can in principle explain reality, because I think of prehension not as just being on the mind side of the equation. It's specifically the bridge between the old concepts of matter and mind. It's how the objective data of the past becomes subjective again in the present. It's a movement from object to subject and back again, from physical to mental, if you want to, back to physical in the sense of, the process of concrescence, um, being having both a physical and a mental pole. So it's not, I think you lose the
Yeah,
novelty of
okay.
the concept if it's just mental,
Yeah. And then there's even the further question about the generalization of the term mental, even when restricted to the mental pole, because like
Yeah.
just
Right.
in resonance with what I was saying about a feeling and experience, because you know, I, does the fact that a relational view of space or anything shares certain properties with mind indicate that it is mind? Or that mind is fundamental, or does it, are we saying that this kind of relationality or contextuality, which is very characteristic of the mental, is generic, and we should thus expect that the mind, of course, being a manifestation of something much more generic, would partake in it, but that doesn't come along with a an argument built in about the generic nature of the mental, even in the more nuanced, like properly full sense that Whitehead is generalizing it, which is perhaps slightly elided by the way Hartshorne put it there. It still doesn't mean that again, it still doesn't make this a panpsychism, let's say, um, operationally. That becomes again a choice about the language. It becomes
Sure.
a kind of again ad hoc gloss. It's a way of dressing up the relations themselves. All you're really saying is that this is a relational thing, and that there's a robust sense of possibility here, which corresponds to the mental pole.
Right.
Um,
Right.
and it's very traditional. I would agree that it's very traditional to identify the mental, like the virtual, let's say, or potentiality with the mental. And obviously Peirce does the same. I mean, Peirce is an idealist. Um, but is that a necessary move? Like, I don't think that's dictated by the logic again. I think that's a contingent historical move.
Yeah.
Uh, we can be
Yeah.
critical.
I mean, I think just on the level of rhetoric, because physicalism has been dominant, at least in the academy in our day, it's to understand prehension, I think we both have to deflate the Cartesian idea of mind or the Kantian idea of mind, and we have to inflate the idea of matter that we have had, to balance things out here. And prehension, I don't think should again fall on either side of that dualism. And Hartshorne gets this, that the whole point of saying mind is extended in some sense in a relational conception of space and space-time is to avoid dualism, um, and to avoid materialism, which would just try to explain away mind as something. If it's unextended, then it doesn't really exist. Or skepticism or kind of Mysterianism. Like we want to avoid those modern problems by not seeing mind as just um, unextended or inextended. So yeah, prehensions, it's an amphibious concept, right? It lives in what used to be called matter and what used to be called mind. It specifically bridges the two if we want to even distinguish them without separating them, which is number seven, I think. Hume's axiom, um,
Uh, yeah.
which I mean, yeah, I'm kind of tempted to go to that one just because I think that's an interesting connection to make to avoid dualism while still maintaining a polarity.
Yeah.
Um, like we still have in Whitehead at least mental or conceptual and physical prehensions, and I know Hartshorne wants to get what Whitehead's getting from his conceptual prehensions of eternal objects just through physical prehensions, but I think there's an interesting um, thing there that would take me a minute to unpack, and I don't want to quite go there yet. I want to stay on with number seven, because Hume's axiom, Hartshorne says that he thinks he's the first. He, he says, I seem to be the first to say all this in plain language, namely that we can distinguish without separating. And he thinks, Hume asserting that any distinction is already a separation. Um, it's in a sense not understanding the conceptual significance of vagueness and being able to distinguish things without needing them to be clearly separate. Um, when we analyze a concrescence or an actual occasion into its prehensions, it's always it's genetic analysis, Whitehead calls it. It's always an as if sort of hypothetical thing because prehensions can't actually be separated. We can distinguish them vaguely, but they're in he uses Leibniz's terms, a pre-established harmony with one another. All the prehensions require one another and grow together into that concrete entity. So when we analyze them, it's always as if, and I think we need to be able to distinguish without separating in order to do that type of genetic analysis. But the thing is, there's an interesting historical tidbit that Hartshorne claims that he seems to be the first to say all this in plain language. I think it was actually Samuel Taylor Coleridge interpreting Schelling and Fichte on the importance of polarity in our thinking and our holding dialectical tensions basically. And I just want to read something that Owen Barfield says about Coleridge on this point specifically. And uh, this was probably published in the 60s by Barfield. Anyways, it doesn't matter who the priority of stating this in clear language is, but Barfield says one of the most valuable lessons I learned from Coleridge is to detect that terribly obsessive and terribly contemporary fallacy, which supposes that we must only distinguish things that we are also able to divide. It is closely allied to an obsession with space as the criterion of reality. When we divide things, we set them aside, either in fact or in imagination, side by side in space. But space is not the be all and end all, and there are many things that, by reason of their interpenetration, cannot be divided, though they are easily distinguished.
Mhm.
Acquaintance and friendship, for example, or envy and hatred. For human consciousness as it is today, thinking and perceiving comes within that class. So for Barfield, we can't fully separate thinking and perceiving, which is interesting. I think Whitehead
Yeah,
and Hartson would agree we can't fully separate conceptual prehension and physical prehension. Um,
there's a lot of really interesting stuff in this article about perception and memory as well, right?
right.
Um, and not being fully distinguishable.
But yeah, I mean, as a blockage to understanding the nature of prehension and its amphibious
Mhm.
dipolar nature, I think Hume's axiom stands in the way because we want that clear and distinct logic that says, distinction is separation. Whereas if we have some sense of the importance of vagueness, then we can work with the idea of prehension.
Well, and I think it's just if we have some important, if we have an understanding of the nature of contextuality,
Hmm.
and relationality, and the
Right.
way that we can't assume an ideal. So this is dependent co-arising for the Buddhists. We can't assume the identity of all of the separate elements as though it exists distinct from the nexus of relations that it's in, so that it is a context-free, that there is a context-free property of identity. And it really reminds me the way Hartson talks about what he calls Hume's axiom here, which is totally unrelated to Hume's principle. But as it's commonly used in philosophy of mathematics. But it reminds me of the mean field theory, which is like a classic assumption in a lot of mathematical models, which is essentially the positing. It's another one of these things a little bit like ergodicity and Laplace normality and stuff, where it's the positing of a pre-existing global state that all of the individual parts are in conformity with. So basically, they are all mutually independent of one another in the sense that the average effect that they get from the assemblage of other discrete elements in this system or population that we're looking at, basically the effect can be averaged out. So they all experience approximately the same effects
Mm.
from their neighbors. So it kind of excises relationality altogether and contextuality altogether, as a kind of simplifying assumption for making tractable equations and things. And I mean it works in a lot of contexts, but then there are a whole lot of other contexts where it really breaks down because relationality is so incredibly important. And it breaks down in terms of things like phase transitions, where suddenly things start becoming very correlated in sort of local ways, and they start driving the whole behavior of the system in a way that is very distinct from them all exerting a essentially equal and averageable out effect on one another. And it crops up like everywhere in sort of in mathematical models. But then again, there are lots of well-characterized examples of where it breaks down. But it's like if you were doing population genetics or something, and you had a population of organisms, and you assume like a certain effective population size, and you assume random assortative mating, as though like any individual is equally likely to mate with any other individual, right? Whereas I mean, both in a small population, this wouldn't hold, but in a population where there's non-random mating, because there are other kinds of dynamics which don't dictate, that the male fairy wren with the brightest blue, or who can maintain his blue for the longest, actually massively disproportionately mates with the other females, or, the biggest gorilla, or whatever it might be. There are all kinds of real world situations in which these kinds of assumptions break down, and you end up with a very kind of localized dynamic, which so again, how lucid I'm being here, I don't know, but he talks about it as a kind of symmetry that Hume is assuming, right? Because again, he's assuming that that all of the relations, because things are definable independent of their relations, all the relations are essentially equal or averageable out, as opposed to like very biased in their distributions. And it is a matter of the way we relate the whole to the local. Do we start with the whole and assume a basically a uniformity at the level of the whole, such that any kind of perturbations at the level of the local can be evened out, given the full, like things like ergodicity again and Laplace normality, given the fullness of time, or given exhaustible given exhaustive sampling, you would see that all of these things kind of even out? Or do we, on the other hand, go from the local to the global, where we say that these things that are happening here in this very, very specific manner are in fact, like, there is no global state except that which is derived and continually deformed by, and that's really important, like continually changed by, but of course in a way that becomes very, very complex to model, because because again, in a drastically non-equal way, this event has way more influence on the global behavior of the system than this event, and you can't just treat them as equal, essentially. Okay, I
Right.
don't know if that was very lucid, but that was what I was thinking about when he was talking about Hume's axiom of mutual independence, basically there. Whereas
Right.
again, prehension as a principle of relationality, dependent co-arising, and all of that is precisely the antithesis of that. It's saying like the
Mhm.
relations that you are involved in are in fact, not, I don't want to say determinative of, but are, define your identity and your character and all of that.
So is this basically like saying, yes, everything is connected, but not in the same way and to the same degree in every case, right? So, um,
That would be a very, yeah.
well,
Uh,
this is William James's defense of a kind of pluralism that still has leaves room for internal relations. I mean, and Whitehead has a pluralism that leaves room for internal relations. It's like, um, yes, everything is connected, but not in just a smeared out globalism, but where everything is connected to everything else in the same way. There are local relationships and complex networks of priority in a sense, and this is how we distinguish between perception and memory, right? Or how Hartshorne does, using Whitehead's idea of prehension, that memory concerns our prehension of a prior occasion of our own sort of lineage of um, our personally ordered society. Hartshorne says, Whitehead would say um, uh, a nexus, just because our stream of consciousness is not as habituated or canalized as a society. Um, but nonetheless, we distinguish uh, memory as a prehension of our own past, whereas perception is a prehension of something that's kind of, relatively speaking, outside that intimate chain of interrelated occasions.
oh yeah, yeah. No, I really like that point. Um, there's obviously a way that I would connect that to some things that we've talked about before in terms of like interlineage. So separate from perception in the way Hartshorne is talking about it, but again, operationally analogous to this kind of interlineage effect in ecology, basically. But as one can exemplify this with chemical ecology in terms of the informative molecule that acts in a
Yeah.
way that is operationally indistinguishable from something that was produced by the lineage, but actually comes from a different lineage with kind of a different set of motivations attached to it in a certain sense, right? Well, I mean, in a very obvious sense, like it might be coming in specifically to disrupt, but because it's the same kind of thing, operationally speaking, this is why organisms are not operationally closed.
Right,
Um,
exactly. I was just going to go there. This difference between memory and perception perfectly captures that, I think.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
Why they're
yeah.
not closed.
Yeah, no, precisely. But constitutively open, and so I think in a way people can wave away perception a little bit here because they, when they're talking about operational closure, they can sort of say, oh well, yes, of course the organism is perceiving its environment and kind of adaptively responding to that, but it's doing that in a way that is operationally, it's defined by its own set of operators, which are, internal to the lineage or internal to the individual organism. But when an operator, which is of exactly the same kind, so a bioactive molecule, comes from outside the lineage and enters into that, supposedly closed organizational economy and reorders it, that becomes for me a very vivid example of the way you can't make that distinction. And then you might be able to tie that back to perception and say that perception is already problematizing this issue of operational closure. Because otherwise, like, how does perception act? Like, it is changing an order of molecular
Right.
interaction in the organism. Obviously, again, they might say, yeah, but that's dictated by the intrinsic degrees of freedom of the organism, blah 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 blah. So it's not a fundamental reordering, it's still staying, where.
Right. As long as we say that an organism is relatively operationally closed, but constantly being not just perturbed, but punctured by. I mean, if the prehensive relation is logically the same, whether it's memory, prehension of our own past, the
Yeah.
organism's own past, or prehension, perception of the external environment impinging upon it, it's the same type of relation. You can't have the organism be totally operationally closed in the sense that it can't receive data from its environment.
Yeah,
Uh,
and reorganize itself. I guess the distinction is it reorganizing itself in response to something that it's perceiving, or is it being reorganized? And then, there are all of these fascinating sort of transitional cases where you've got, say, the development of, say, toxin resistance or something like that. So the organism actually has degrees of freedom, and this could be in developmental time, especially with microbes and things. They could switch like their entire metabolic pathway in order to cope with a certain kind of perturbation, or it could be in evolutionary time, like an evolution across generations of a certain resistance to a toxin or whatever. So that might be an example of the organism reestablishing a certain kind of relative operational closure. It's now not as vulnerable to that kind of perturbation. But again, I would want to distinguish these from small, from perturbations, which the organism just, constitutively readjusted to. And then there's the completely other kinds of examples where a totally new organism is created, and that can either be, again, there are transitional forms. We should get to Whitehead on transitional forms as well, because it's another thing that Hartshorne kind of points at as a potential issue with Whitehead's philosophy. And there's something that you and I can't even remember where it came from, that you and I read in the past, where Whitehead was sort of saying, well, without the eternal objects, you wouldn't be able to explain the relative dearth of transitional forms in biological systems. And I'm like, no, there are. Do you remember when we read that? I think we were just talking on WhatsApp, but I need to find the Hartshorne quote. We're a bit all over the place now, but there are these examples, of course, where a novel composite organism is derived, and there are lots of vivid examples in parasitism, right, where, say, like the goals of the parasite are being installed into the phenotype of the host, creating a novel composite organism which is kind of like possessed by the parasite. But then, of course, the limit case is your endosymbiotic cases where, again, there are grades there. There's, things we've talked about before, I think, where one organism from one lineage requires effector molecules from another organism in another lineage to achieve its mature phenotype, for example, like in metamorphosis. And that's kind of generic in holometabolous organisms, particularly in marine contexts, but also for holometabolous insects. So those that go from a larval stage to an imago that's quite structurally different, they often require effector molecules, like their microbiome might have to be in a particular state, or they might require some metabolites that they get from a plant or whatever, and and all sorts of complex things going on there. And then, of course, the real limit is this sort of Lynn Margulis type endosymbiosis, where like a whole organism gets incorporated into the physiology of another one, as with mitochondria and chloroplasts and stuff. So there are all of these examples, and again, all of these gradations within them, which problematize this notion of operational closure. Uh, and again, they connect, I guess they connect back in interesting ways to prehension and sort of relationality and contextuality by being ecological phenomena. They are relational phenomena and showing how what you are, but at all these different non-trivial scales, what you are is defined by the set of relations that you are in. And there's no sense in which, what Hume presupposes in terms of a certain mutual independence, or what's presupposed by something like, a neat mathematical trick like the mean field theory, there's no sense in which that can hold, generically across all sorts of systems that are mutually modifying one another. Um,
I found that quote about biological evolution and intermediate forms. It's
huh.
when it's when Whitehead's comparing Newton and Newton's scholium and Plato's Timaeus, and he thinks that um, Plato was intimating at least something approaching the modern quantum theory with his idea of these different distinct elements, and that nature seems to have this intelligibility about it, whereby it comes in leaps that aren't simply smoothly transitioning between each other. So he says the theory of biological evolution would not in itself lead us to expect the sharply distinguished genera and species which we find in nature. There might be an occasional bunching of individuals around certain typical forms, but there is no explanation of the almost complete absence of intermediate forms.
Yeah, no, that's a major faux pas in my opinion.
Mhm.
Again, we'll get to now. We should move to number 15, nominalism, which I just love this little section of Hartshorne's paper. I mean, if you're ready to go there, but it really connects
Well,
to
I
them.
just wonder if
Yeah.
obviously, there's a certain kind of critique of the lack of intermediate forms that intelligent design theorists or creationists, whatever, would come up with. But I interpreted Whitehead there to be talking about the way that something more like, Gould's punctuated equilibria, or that like mutations in phenotypes, not just genetic, but the endosymbiot or with symbiogenesis is an example of like dramatic transformation that's not continuous, or gradual. It's not. So I hear that as a critique of gradualism, which I think
Yeah,
we would want to critique, right? I mean, you're the biologist. I don't know.
yeah. Well, can you read the last sentence again about transitional forms?
There might be an occasional bunching of individuals around certain typical forms, but there is no explanation of the almost complete absence of intermediate forms. So there
Okay.
are intermediate forms, is what your point is, right?
So gradualism is real, and punctuated equilibrium is also real, right? They're
Mhm.
just, it's a matter of emphasis. So you can go through a whole heap of examples of punctuated equilibrium, and it's not even, I mean, of course, it's not original to Gould and Eldridge, who wrote. It's a great paper, and very, very important. And they're identifying something very real. And they're of course, I think it's Gould and Lewontin, but the critiques of adaptationism that Gould makes are also incredibly important and really do connect with this ontological stuff too. As you know, you and I have talked about, at least in private, the connection between adaptationism and actualism, and that's something we could potentially get into. But see, what Whitehead's saying there, I don't think quite maps onto what, the way you want to interpret him. I'd say so, nature does, there's the famous sort of natura non facit saltatio, nature doesn't admit of saltation, right? And that's the gradualist credo. And of course it does. And of course, people like Waddington were saying this with genetic assimilation. Richard Goldschmidt, who kind of got, quite, vilified, tarred and feathered to some degree for his theory of like hopeful monsters. It's kind of a return to Empedocles in a way, but he's saying that there could be these saltatory leaps, like major reorganizations of the phenotype, which may or may not be functional, but might lead to sort of major evolutionary transitions. God, there's so much to say about this, because another thing I've been thinking about a lot recently is Mike Levins, and we were talking about Mike, but planaria experiments
Mm.
with barium resistance, right? So there's this quite amazing experiments that they did where they exposed planaria to barium, and so the argument is that planaria have never had a historical exposure to high concentrations of barium, and like surprise, surprise, it's toxic to them.
Head
Um,
explodes, right?
yeah. So yeah, exactly. But pretty much, yeah, it causes a degeneration of the head. But then they undergo this incredible transcriptomic reshuffling until they derive, like a single individual derives a barium resistant phenotype and then regrows its head, and then it can live quite happily in this like high barium environment. But then if you put them back in a low barium environment for 30 days, they become sensitive again. So they reorganize their physiology basically to the previous barium sensitive phenotype, and then you can repeat the whole thing again. And so they obviously have this extraordinary plasticity. And this would take us kind of far afield, but it actually really interestingly aligns with certain notions that Ross Ashby, the early cyberneticist Ashby, he of the good regulator theorem, Conant and Ashby, and he had this theory of ultra stability, that an ultra stable system like an organism, if put into a regime which it couldn't cope with, could start to reorganize itself randomly, and just keep trying out different combinations until it reached a novel equilibrium, like a new steady state, essentially, that was viable in that environment, and then it would stop doing that. And even like early cyberneticians were like, "Whoa, I don't know what you're talking about." Funnily enough, I've looked a little bit at Catherine Nave's recent book, A Drive to Survive on the FEP, and I don't know exactly where she takes this, but she talks about Ashby and ultra stability, and about how this is a very bizarre concept, and even his fellow cyberneticians didn't dig this, and I don't know where she ends up with that, but the reality is that that is exactly what the planaria are doing, and it's also what lots of microbe populations and other study systems have been shown to do in response to stress. Yeah,
Is
sorry.
is Ashby there allowing for what Peirce would call abduction? And this would be a abduction at the level of morphogenesis, where it's not just a lucky guess that the planaria happens to find the right way of becoming adapted to the barium. It's that there's something um, about the collective intelligence of that cellular network that allows it to find the solution much faster than just randomly searching through the possibility space, right?
Well, I mean, there's a question of whether it does find it much faster and how we would quantify that. And of course, the plasticity that something like planaria have, or that some microbes have, and yeast have, and other things, is itself an evolved feature of the systems, and a
Right.
particular. Uh,
So, I
and
mean, but the difference between it's what, when Hartshorne talks about guessing, um,
Yeah,
and then
why we can make
educated guesses, which is what
yeah.
you're saying. There's a lineage with that this flatworm has that allows it to make an educated guess. You
Well, in
know,
a sense, it's got a target state, right? So something is remaining invariant there, that it's trying to find a way to recapitulate under very changed circumstances. So
right.
it's got a target state,
Ah,
like
right.
meta-
So yeah, the target state is what constrains the possibilities it can search through. Right.
Yeah, yeah, and of course, and also the environment. So it's the
Right.
interaction between the environment, this barium, high barium environment, and the pre-existing, because evolved, target state of the viable planarian phenotype, that are interacting in this way. And I think with abduction, and I'm like loath to because I know I have friends who don't want abduction to be trivialized at all, and it shouldn't, but. We should remember that it's inference to an explanation, not inference to the best explanation. So it's not just a direct intuition or intuiting of the viable, like the planarian doesn't just jump we can presume, from this no longer functioning phenotype to a new phenotype, that it has no history of select. It must enter into some kind of exploratory mode.
Mm.
And that's what abduction is for Peirce, where he says it's inference to an explanation. And this is where, I probably wasn't clear enough when we were critiquing the naturalizing relevance realization paper, and then I had that back and forth with John Vervaeke about it, because it's not so much that it's abjectly random, but it's stochastic, but in contact with the target state and the environment. So it's got to work. It's got constraints on it. It's not abjectly random. And again, of course, it's within the degrees of freedom that the organism has to reorganize itself. So it's constrained in all of these different ways. It's not just like abjectly random, if that even makes any kind of sense. I don't really think that that does. But it's arbitrary in the sense that the organism doesn't know ahead of time what's going to work. It just needs to know this isn't working, and I need to start exploring possibilities that might work. So I infer to an explanation, and then in the interaction of what I throw at the wall, like for spitballing, if it sticks on the wall, it's worked. If it
Right.
but it will quickly be cycling through these different options until something tells it that, in this environmental situation, in this context. So it's very context dependent is the important thing, right? Abduction is very context dependent, and it's context dependent again, both in terms of the evolved target state and degrees of freedom of the system to reorganize itself, because a lot of other critters just wouldn't be able to do that. And the specific environmental context. So it's prehension in this nice way. It's non-Humean in this nice way that it's very relationally constrained, both by diachronic or evolved relationality and synchronic or ecological, or like, right now we're in this environmental context. And it's the combination of those things which will dictate what is the good explanation in an abductive sense, or what is the viable novel phenotype. It's not just a leap into the complete,
Yeah.
there's a constraint on what we're trying to achieve here. Um,
But to make an anthropomorphic analogy here, though, I think for Peirce as for Hartshorn, we can say that what the flatworm is doing to adapt to barium is akin to, in Hartshorn's case, he talks about the Greek atomists deserving admiration for their brilliant guess about the microstructure of the world. And it was not a merely lucky guess, he puts in parentheses. And Peirce uses the example of Galileo, I think, in the essay we read, I guess at the Riddle, I think, where he
yeah.
talks about, some of Galileo's hypotheses, if you were to, in looking for the right way of mathematizing, if it was just a random guess, it should have taken him a lot longer to arrive at, and Peirce's uh, rendering of it at least.
Yeah. So can we get back to the transitional forms thing?
Yeah,
I guess we're still on that, but can we linger on that and then go into the nominalism thing? Uh,
definitely.
there are definitely saltations. I think we've covered that, and we can give a lot of really fascinating examples of punctuated equilibrium. Like a lot of the study systems that I've worked on with it's kind of classic molecular evolution in a sense, right? Like it's not some exotic thing like this, barium, insensitivity in a developmental context, being achieved by these planaria, which seems in some sense more exotic, though I think it does admit of modulo various other things, the same kind of reasoning, the same kind of logic. But we see, for example, when a member of a gene family is recruited for a function in a toxin secreting system, so when it acquires a function outside the body of the producing organism, I say an exochemical, exo meaning on the outside, that can be, again, there are lots of other things to say, but associated with a certain acquisition of novel degrees of freedom at the level of the molecular evolution itself. This is tied into things like, most gene products that are expressed and find their targets inside the bodies of the organisms that produce them have various kind of gene dosage constraints and things like that. Like you can't express too much of this thing because you might start to poison yourself, for example, right? But when most of the expression is going on the outside of the organism's body or into some container like the lumen of a venom gland in readiness for deployment outside the body, there's not this same risk of autotoxicity. So this is very reliant on regulation of gene expression, so restriction of gene expression, of the expression of certain loci, gene loci, to a particular tissue like a secretory organ. And then something that can happen, again, there are other things that have to come together for this to happen, is that duplicates of that gene, so the gene can be duplicated and duplicates can accumulate. One of the problems often with accumulating duplicate genes, copies of a gene, is that again, unless there is a regulatory compensation, a change in the regulatory dynamics, which down regulates the expression of those additional copies, you will just get more and more of the gene product. But you don't have that issue necessarily in one of these secretory systems. So you can start to accumulate copies. And so basically what I'm saying here, this becomes an example of punctuated equilibrium, because you go from like all organisms have, on average 3 to 5 copies of this gene. I'm just making this up, but across hundreds of millions of years of evolution. It's an ancient gene family. It's got very important conserved regulatory functions, and you basically need about 3 copies to fulfill those functions. And there seems to be some strong selection on not having more than that. Hence, there's this conserved genotype across massive amount of evolutionary time. But here in this particular lineage, where it's been recruited for this function in venom, say, they've got 30 copies of it. Just in this lineage. And so what you can see is there's a big jump there. There hasn't been a gradual accumulation across the tree of life of multiple copies of this gene. Everywhere else it's heavily constrained, but in this one lineage it's explosively diversifying. And of course that kind of redundancy does lead to the origins of novel functions, because all of those individual genes can now vary somewhat independently. Not to go back to mean field theory stuff, but somewhat independently of one another, because there is genetic redundancy, there's robustness at the level of the phenotype associated with that redundancy, etc. So basically, all I'm saying is there are all sorts of mechanisms which enable various kinds of punctuated evolutionary transitions to happen. And then there's all the the Waddington stuff and Goldschmidt stuff, which now I think, and even the Ashby thing to some degree, are essentially validated. But what Whitehead seems to be saying there is that there's an absence of transitional forms. That I think is very wrong, because I think sometimes, yes, there are lineages where you don't see the transitional forms. I mean, we can give principal accounts of why that might be. And that, of course, includes survivor bias, which exists both in, classic selection sense, but also exists in the fossil record and all of that sort of thing. Of course, in the genomics era, we see transitional forms in a different way than we did when we were just studying gross morphology. That's another thing to talk about. Well, not to talk about, but just to like bracket it away. But also in some systems, like again, venom systems, the number of transitional forms even present, like transitional forms, and we've got to get to the Nietzsche critique of transitional forms, or the nominalist critique of transitional forms in just a second, because that is important. But the number of transitional forms that are present in extant species is like crazy. Like I would have said this to you many times before, but you can take a single family of snakes, you can take Lampropidae, it's a family of snakes, and every single arrangement that we see across all snakes of the development of the venom system is basically present in that single family. So everything from species which have no differentiated fangs, very small toxin secreting gland, etc., all the way through to like front-fanged species with hollow glands, hollow fangs, big glands, compressor musculature, I don't want to overload with details, but there are rear-fanged species. There are species with a little bit of compressor musculature. There are ones with a lot of compressor, like there's all of these, there's like a series that if you were to stipulate that the forms were the lack of a venom system and the very highly developed, which I'm already, presupposing this kind of distinction when I say highly developed, but the lack of a venom system and the front-fanged hypodermic, derived condition. If you were to say that these are the forms, um, there would be every kind of transitional form in between those, and not just in a fossil record, not just that we forensically detect through some comparative genomic study, but actually in the extant species themselves. So I think Whitehead is very wrong about that, but there is the nominalist critique of the existence of transitional forms, which is essentially to say that you stipulate that the forms are the non-front fang condition and the front fang, or the like no venom system and the front fanged condition, and then you say all the other forms are transitional, whereas in fact each of those forms is equally valid in its own right, and it's only you that has placed them on a series, right, in a series. So there are no transitional forms in that sense, because every form is, this is the nominalist view, right? Every particular is, equally real or whatever in its own sense. And I think
Yeah.
that that is a more valid critique, but I just think these are two different ways of framing a system. I think we can admit both.
Yeah. No, I think I fully accept what you're saying here about Whitehead's quip about in passing about transitional forms. I just think I wonder if you agree with his point, and with without dwelling on that specific misstep about how I think what he's saying is there's some kind of analogy between the way that electrons fall into certain shells in an atom. There's certain energy states that it's possible for an electron to be in, just as evolutionarily in the biological world. There's a way in which there's like a landscape of evolutionary possibility or phenotypic possibility that's not simply smooth,
Yeah.
um, right? I think that's his larger point.
Yeah, well, I think, with the natural induction discussion, we talked a little bit about,
Right.
smooth and rugged landscapes, and the importance of the, frustration and rugged landscapes, and all of that. And that is, of course, a very important point. If all the landscapes are smooth, well, nothing happens, and
It
or
can't be evolution. There can't be evolution, which is his critique of Newton. I mean, that's in
yeah.
that context, that's the critique of Newton um, that he's making there. But
Yeah, but I think what he's also speaking about there, it is a defense of the doctrine of eternal objects as well, and that's what I think is probably mistaken, because I think where we see these systems, which are very dynamic in their evolution, we see that they are in fact kind of all over the place. So it's sort
Mhm.
of the difference between, we were talking also in private about the distinction between like rhizomes and trees, and a kind of, looking at diachronic relations over very long periods of time, and then ending up looking and being tree-like. But then when you look at um, relations like synchronic relations in ecological context, but if you also look at even diachronic relations in those systems where there's very dynamic evolution of the character traits that you're actually examining. So if you were to look at spiders or scorpions or centipedes or a lot of things, and look at their venom systems, they're pretty stable. Or cnidarians, cnidarians are diverse in all sorts of ways. These are jellyfish, corals, anemones, hydrozoans. Um, they're very diverse in a lot of ways, but there is a shared, like a synapomorphy of the whole clade, which is the structure of the cnidocyte itself. Even though there is fine scale variation there, the stinging cell is pretty consistent, and so spiders all have pretty similar, almost without exceptions. I mean, their fangs might go like this in araneomorphs, or they might go like this in mygalomorphs, but the structure of the venom system is very conserved. Same with scorpions. So you look at systems which evolved a particular character state a really, really long time ago, and you're like, look, it's really locked on this particular form, and there are no transitional forms. But if you look at systems, organismal lineages, and you're looking at specific traits which are undergoing very dynamic evolution in the recent past, then you see all of this variation. It's like, wow, there are so many transitional forms at this point. So the things aren't kind of a priori, and this is the thing about eternal objects, they're not a priori clustering into definite forms. Those
Yeah.
definite are themselves achieved, not in a normative sense, but they are the consequence of a long evolutionary history of exploration of all of these zones of intermediacy, right? So they didn't exist prior. There's no sense in saying that they existed prior in their particular definiteness prior to the actual traversing of the landscape of possibility. And so this is what Hartshorne says. I mean, I think we should get into this in some detail because number 15 on nominalism is one of the best parts of this paper, in my opinion. But nominalism has two aspects distinguished by Peirce better than anyone else. It's one thing to say that universals exist as though the world were populated, so to speak, by particular actualities and also non-particular actualities. In criticizing this view, the nominalists are strong. Whitehead is uncomfortably close to this vulnerable doctrine in his talk of eternal objects. I know you want to defend him there, and we'll get to that, even though he insists that these are only divine concepts. Okay, or I might want to critique that. He neglects the argument. Here we go. This is the transitional forms bit. He neglects the argument that degrees of difference and similarity can go far to explain our classifications and descriptions of things without resort to eternal elements. That's what I'm saying. And I think in that thing about Plato versus Newton, yeah, I'm on Plato's side and I'm on Whitehead's side against Newton, like obviously. But I think he is presupposing a doctrine of the eternal elements, which are then showing up in the clustering of, organisms around particular
Mm.
discrete forms, and this apparently saltatory thing in evolution. Now, again, there's a viable critique of gradualism. The saltatory thing is not just the consequence of the loss of intermediate forms, over the course of evolution, but it is partly that as well. And so we have to hold that
Right.
tension. And then there's a
Yeah.
bunch of stuff on nominalism here, but I think you want to respond to that bit first.
Well, it's very interesting that, the next sentence after the intermediate forms one that I read earlier is Whitehead saying, again, Newton's scholium gives us no hint of the 92 possibilities for atoms of the periodic table or of the limited number of ways in which atoms can be combined so as to form molecules. Physicists
Yeah.
are explaining these chemical facts by means of conceptions which Plato would have welcomed. And so whether or not that means there's some sort of pre-definite um, set of eternal objects that's determining that the universe would evolve so as to give rise to specifically those 92 possibilities of atoms. I don't think that's what Whitehead's saying. Obviously, that would refute the entire basis of his his account of emergent evolution, as he calls it, and that there's an open-endedness of the future, and the eternal objects aren't causes of anything. But I think
Mhm.
what he's trying to say is that there is some degree of definiteness to the realm of possibility that's of course always being um, uh, transformed by what gets actualized in the course of history. Um, and
This
so,
is the key point, right? Because obviously I agree with you totally up to that point. What is the nature of that transformation? Is
yeah,
it a reordering, or is it in fact the genesis of definiteness and determinacy in that realm of possibility itself? So yes, it's a reordering, but is it also the origins of the definite states themselves, or are those all predefined? So the
right,
thing that Whitehead is vulnerable to here, and I mean, I'm not the only one saying it. Hartshorne is saying it, and
well,
Randall Auxier is standing up as the champion of this view, right?
yeah,
Um, like he's saying that Whitehead is very definitely saying that there is a predefined space of possibility, predefined with predefinite, predeterminate, in fact, Auxier wants to say, right?
yeah,
Um, states of possibility. And it just so happens we talked about, I mean, we mentioned in passing ergodicity, mean field theory, Laplace normality, like all of these tacit assumptions in the major, um, uh, you know, formalisms that are used in physics and elsewhere in the free energy principle, indeed, are predicated on the pre-existence of a state of possibility, a pre-existent global state. And then you can imagine the system as, navigating that and perhaps selectively realizing, selectively ingressing certain of those possibilities in a path-dependent manner, but nonetheless that path is traversing a predefined matrix of possibility. And Whitehead often sounds like that's what he's
Yeah,
saying.
there are two extremes here that we want to avoid, right? Um, I think eliminating any kind of definiteness, and then versus so overstating the definiteness that it just seems like determinism. Like in, I think this example of the atomic elements is apt. In Science in the Modern World, Whitehead talks about the evolution of the universe and that the first, if we think of physics as the study of the smaller organisms, as he says, then we have an example of symbiogenesis occurring when the first proton and the first electron formed a hydrogen atom, and that relationship was advantageous, and it gave rise to a new environment too. All of a sudden, gravity becomes very important, in addition to just plasma electricity dynamics that would have existed before you had atoms. And so that symbiogenesis event is not determined in advance for Whitehead. It's very clear that that's an example of emergent evolution and creative advance. But there's also, as then, stars form and heavier elements emerge, there's some kind of mathematical harmony that's being achieved here that's, if it's not fully predeterminate, why is there such a structure of like as if each atom were a note that forms this cosmic harmony? There's some deep mathematical structure there, and the Pythagoreans are not crazy for seeing this as, you know, uh, um, they overstate the case by saying reality is made of numbers, but there is some kind of a, mathematical mystery at play here that leads to a kind of harmony that you wouldn't expect to be there if the field of possibility is just blank, waiting for something actual to happen. There seems to be a gradient to it that is tilted towards harmony. Um,
Well, I agree with some of that. I think again, it's such a fine point of difference here. Like clearly, if there was abject homogeneity,
mhm.
as opposed to a kind of many one, but as opposed to a unity in multiplicity or something like that, but which could be predefinite maybe, at the beginning of it all, if there was just some completely flat, smooth landscape, if it was just, Gibbs's absolute, surface of absolute stability at the beginning of time, well, nothing would happen, right? So that's obvious. So you can't start that way. Um, but harmony, well, that's a relational property, right? So it might be quite easy to say it'll sound facile in a way, but things either are in harmony or they don't exist in a sense, right? Because you come into a space um, which is already, defined by history of actualization. And you have to come into some kind of conformity with that, even though your coming into being also changes that space, and other things have to reciprocally adjust to correspond to that. And of course, harmony breaks down because again, absolute harmony would be equally problematic in the sense that that sounds like again some sort of surface of absolute stability. Like there's nothing
Yeah.
more harmonious than an undifferentiated whole. Um, that's
Yeah.
equally where we don't want to be. Um,
Very low intensity of harmonization, though, in Whitehead's sense of intensity as
mhm.
maximal diversity brought into contrast. Um, but let me so let's read Hartshorne's claim here that he can get rid of eternal objects and conceptual prehensions and only make reference to physical prehensions, where he says, as long as we include in our conception of physical prehensions a minimal sense of futurity and a sense of a contrast among the prehended data, so a sense of the similarity and difference among prehended data, he thinks is all we need are contrasts, which is one of Whitehead's other categories, and the distinction between the future and the past, so we don't reduce the future to a kind of already particularized,
Yeah.
which is what nominalists do. The future is already particularized for the nominalist, just like the past. And Hartshorne wants the future to be a vague potentiality. So he's still insisting on that distinction between actuality and potentiality. And I guess in um, Randy Oxier's terms, that would make Hartshorne a soft actualist, which he was accusing everybody of being, um,
Everyone was.
who claims to criticize actualism. But I think Hartshorne also, in pointing to physical prehension, he makes a proviso where he says on 256 or page 4 of the PDF, he says, um, we can only make reference to physical prehension provided that certain aspects of God as prehending and prehended be included among the realities classified as past in each given case. And so, in other words, Hartshorne is saying, oh, we don't need those eternal objects. All we need is the physical pole. So long as God's included in what we feel in the physical pole, then we're good. And what's interesting is Whitehead ends up saying the same thing in Process and Reality. On page 250, he infamously or famously, I think famously, because it's an example of his open-ended metaphysical method here, he abolishes the category of conceptual reversion. And I need to explain what that means. In that context, he's having a conversation about Hume and how Hume has this thought experiment where he's imagining gradations of a shade of color, orange, let's say. But Hume says we would notice when there was a gap between the gradual shading of the color of orange, and Hume thinks, oh well, we could imaginatively fill in that gap. And Whitehead points out that that's actually in conflict with Hume's other statement that there's nothing in the mind that wasn't first in the senses. Hume is saying that we imaginatively add something that we didn't first have an impression of. Um, and Whitehead says, that's an example of conceptual reversion. But when Whitehead starts to really think through his own categories at this point, he realizes that this idea of the primordial nature of God, which we inherit in the physical pole, every actual occasion inherits in its physical pole, is already performing the function of conceptual reversion by ordering the realm of possibilities relevant to our given situation, such that we would have that adjacent shade of orange to fill in to what we had perceived. And so, that this is really clear. I spelled this out beforehand, and I want to share this. So he's with his idea of conceptual reversion. Whitehead's describing how novelty would enter into an actual occasion of experience or into the cosmic process. And conceptual reversion would be happening in the mental pole, which for finite actual occasions is subsequent to the physical pole. It's a second phase of concrescence, which isn't phases in physical time, but that's another story. Um, the first phase would be of the mental pole, would be what he calls conceptual reproduction, because the first phase is actually seeing what was realized in the physical pole, what eternal objects were already realized in the physical pole, so that there's some sense of identity between the mental pole and the physical pole. But after conceptual reproduction, the second phase of the mental pole is conceptual reversion, which is introducing relevant alternative possibilities or eternal objects that were as yet unrealized in the physical pole. And what's going on here is an enriching of the qualitative pattern and intensity of feeling in the newly forming occasion, right? That's why Whitehead's making reference to conceptual reversion. It's intensifying the harmony by introducing diversities that are nonetheless held in conformity with what has come before, and synthesized. And so contrasts are being produced here, and that's what's deepening intensity. But contrasts constrained by the ground of identity, um, and with the physical pole through conceptual reproduction. Um, and this aim at contrast is what, this is why Whitehead would say there's any harmony or any order in the universe, because there's this aim not only is there harmony, but there's ever um, not a static harmony or a simple harmony, but an ever deepening harmony, because there's this aim at contrast. And Whitehead thinks this is evident already in the vibratory nature of electromagnetic radiation, that vibratory um, characteristic of light, say, is an example of conceptual reversion at work, even at the simplest level of nature. So he's abolishing conceptual reversion, though, because he agrees with Hartshorne that God's primordial nature is already prehended in the physical pole, though it's a hybrid prehension, so that we're feeling God's feelings of the realm of possibility, which makes those possibilities not just free floating, but in an actual entity, which is Whitehead's, principle of his ontological principle. So that's all very convoluted, but you ran us through some biology I didn't understand, so now I ran through some Whiteheadian metaphysics that they might not be able to follow. This is all on page 249 and 250 of Process and Reality. But basically, all that's to say, Whitehead is making exactly the same move that Hartshorne is making. And so I think Whitehead is already less Platonist or equally less Platonist as Hartshorne is in this case by abolishing conceptual reversion and the need really for conceptual prehension as something not already provided by physical prehension, so long as we say we have a physical prehension of God's conceptual nature.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it is very convoluted. And I do want to rescind one thing that I said. Obviously, I said, there was nothing more harmonious than unity, which of course is strictly speaking, and given my musical background, I should not say such things, incorrect, unless you're talking about harmony in the overtones. But yeah, I mean, harmony is a relational property which um, does presuppose that there is things that can be in relation to one another, not
Yeah,
just
of
a
course. Yeah.
homogeneity. I think there's, yeah, I mean, I'm definitely not going to be able to pick apart all that stuff there. And I think one way where we might go is we might dive back to Hartshorne and see what he says about God and the nature of God, and then loop it back onto this.
Mhm.
But I think also we've talked before about this principle that Whitehead wants to make fundamental of this increase in intensity through an increase in contrast and basically in differentiation. Um, and I think I think there are just other ways of thinking about the again, not making it a preordained goal, essentially, not making it a sort of global, goal that we increase diversity, but we can see that as an emergent um, uh, product of the filling up of a space. So of I guess of prior differentiation in a sense, right? Um, and therefore the landscape of possibility is becoming increasingly rugged. And so just being constantly transformed in this way. Because I think that the set of possibilities associated with, very like we say, simple systems or primordial systems, like of a primordium, like the function that the primordial nature of God is fulfilling here, should be correspondingly simple, not, you know, just unity, obviously, not because we need a primordial difference, a kind of primordial multiplicity, although it could be an indefinite multiplicity. And we can, obviously look to Simondon and Deleuze and people like that for having elaborated those sorts of concepts. Um, but basically, the more stuff there is, and the more differentiation has already taken place, the more rugged the landscape becomes. And so that you have to, find your own niche, so to speak, in that landscape, and that's going to require a certain, differentiation just to continue going, to fill out that space. Otherwise, obviously, and I mean, this does assume some kind of fundamental drive, So where we're making something, we are still assuming that there is a primordial impetus or drive. Um, so it becomes a kind of vitalist view in that sense, which I think is very consistent with Whitehead in the sense that creativity is his absolutely prior notion. But yeah, can we circle back to the role of God here
Number
by
13.
number 13? Yeah. So hang on, I'm gonna get back to that page now. Because I wonder how much of this you would want to take on board. I define the word, so Hartson says, I define, and we didn't get, by the way, to the end of the nominalism thing, because I think the thing that I really like about what Hartson says about nominalism, we didn't quite fully articulate, but maybe we'll come back to that, maybe we won't. But
Well,
I define, yeah,
well, I think just to make some concessions here, I think it's important to a lot of Whiteheadians who don't like eternal objects they do like Whitehead's concept of proposition, a
yeah,
proposition, which, you just as like, Whitehead has these ultimate categories, actual occasion and not ultimate, but more ultimate, he says, actual occasion, eternal object. When what we usually experience in our everyday lives are societies. Um, just in the same way, when usually our thinking as, the conscious language using animals that we are, is in terms of propositions. And, there's a way in which propositions are actually the more useful um, uh, category that Whitehead develops here. And whether or not they presuppose the distinction between actual occasions and eternal objects is an interesting debate. But I think even if we say that those two ideas, actualities and eternalities in Whitehead's sense, are only limit concepts defined in terms of the other, and that we can never have one pure, existing independently of the other, we can still then have this idea of propositions, which is what Hartshorne is trying to do here by emphasizing the contrasts between similarity and difference of, the data in the past, and emphasizing the futurity um, of potentiality, because, he wants truth to be something that's not fixed and final. And so Whitehead's concept of propositions allows us to prehend propositions about the future that are, if they're generic enough, they can be true. Right, and this is part of, the whole justification for induction and all of that. Um, and so, yeah, that's just all to say. I think there is a problem when actual occasions and eternal objects and the difference between the two get reified. Um, and the really unique and exciting concept is propositions. And I appreciate that Hartshorne is trying to redirect our attention to that, and that would be a way of developing our philosophical thinking and our metaphysical thinking, rather than dwelling on what an eternal object might be independent of any actual occasion. And Whitehead does sometimes talk as though it's meaningful to, say, describe the realm of eternal objects independent of any given actuality. And I don't know that it is meaningful. Um, yeah.
yeah. Well, I think of that as again one of these a certain reification of a certain tacit assumption that comes probably from his sort of logicist mathematical background, because it is exactly the kind of assumption that you find in a lot of formal approaches. So
Mhm.
um,
Yeah.
Hartson says a few interesting things about prehensions, and I guess yeah, about prehensions and propositions.
Right.
Um, But oh yeah, I was gonna. Where were we gonna go? Should we go to the God thing, or I mean,
Yeah. Yeah. Please.
a couple of things that I really like though, which we should probably just read. The again, the thing on nominalism, and also the thing on determinism. Um, but let's go to God and just make sure we try to touch on those at least briefly before we finish. So he says, I define the word God as a label for the one, capital O, who is worshipped because regarded as unsurpassably excellent. Unsurpassable here does not mean perfect in the classical sense of actualizing all possible value. So not actualizing all possible value, right? But still kind of possessing within itself all possibilities for evaluation. Isn't that the function that the primordial nature is providing. But come back to that. What does it say? This would be impossible though because there are incompatible values.
Yeah.
Nor does unsurpassable mean that nothing can be added to the divine reality. It just means there can be no rival to God. So God can, skipping a bunch of things, God can be surpassed, but only by God. So God can be enriched in this sense. The creatures contribute their entire value to God. They enrich the divine life. So I did skip a few things, but how do you I mean, how do you think about that? So I guess it's a kind of panentheist view, the creatures are not, it's not that God is just the whole, all the creatures, etc. The creatures are in fact contributing something to God. Um,
Mhm.
so in a sense, they're internal to God, but enriching God, um, which has an independent existence from them. But do they have an independent existence from God in that case? And how do you feel about the idea that they contribute their entire value to
Mm.
God? And how does that, I mean, if we were going back into a kind of physicsy biological, like we're trying to, cross these levels, what would it suggest that they don't sequester any value for themselves? They don't, it kind of indicates that they don't sequester any internal degrees of freedom in a certain sense, right? They're not then well, they're not independent, they're not distinguishable from God in this sense, because everything that I mean, I'm sort of crossing levels of description here, but everything they own, they contribute to God. So there's nothing about them that God doesn't have. Um, but I
Mm.
don't see how we can maintain a doctrine of kind of, I don't know if individuality is the term that I want, but of frustration as a matter, which
Mm.
is kind of this it is a bit of a correlate of it's an increase in intensity because of an increase in contrast, um, but a
Yes.
frustration so that even within themselves, but between one another, um, systems have competing goals. They're frustrated in this sense, so they can't all optimize simultaneously.
Yeah.
And we know what that would look like. But do we need a divine term which optimizes everything, which smooths out all of that?
Well, God can't smooth it all out. That's why there's evil, and God's not all powerful.
Yeah.
Um,
Okay, yeah.
these opposing aims, that's a fact of life as a finite creature. Um, but yeah, I'm not completely comfortable with Hartshorn here, but nor am I completely comfortable with Whitehead's rendering. And
Mm,
Hartshorn, it's important to note, dramatically changes Whitehead's theology by making God a society, and
mm,
not just an actual entity.
yeah.
Right. And so, when he says God has no rival, in the sense that God can only be surpassed by God, he's talking about, a future occasion of God surpasses a prior occasion of God because of how the world enriches it. And Whitehead still wants to allow for that kind of an enrichment by the world, but you end up in this paradoxical situation where God is both eternal and also growing with the world. And it's very difficult to think Whitehead's two poles of God uh, as one God. I admit, and maybe this is where reason bleeds off into faith of some kind. But at the same time, I want to resist that interpretation because Whitehead's very clear that when he talks about God and his metaphysics, there's nothing to do with worship or religious emotion. And so for Hartshorne to leap right into his initial definition of God as one who is worshipped because regarded as unsurpassably excellent, Whitehead's not talking about God in process and reality uh, as an object to be worshipped. That would be maybe a secondary consequence. Um, but he says that uh, the concept of religious feeling is not an essential element in the concept of God's function in the universe. In this respect, religious literature has been sadly misleading to philosophic theory, partly by attraction and partly by repulsion. Um, so he wants to be able to relate to God in some sense neutrally, not as an object of worship. And so I think there's something more confessional going on in Hartshorn already, um, with that first sentence on number 13. Um, what he says about the nature of God's perfection, I guess uh, Whitehead also says that the primordial nature is perfect but incomplete and unconscious, um, holding together the infinite and the finite aspects um, of God. I think, yeah, we have to find some way of doing that. But in terms of what creatures can, creatures contributing their entire value to God, um, every finite actual occasion is receiving this initial aim from the divine, or you could think of it as an objective aim, and that has to be brought into synthesis with a subjective aim that's unique to that creature. And the objective aim doesn't determine the subjective aim, but it does create this contrast. And, we feel this, and this is very anthropomorphic, and this isn't to be generalized, but human beings have conscience. Why do we have conscience? Because we can compare our actions or our thoughts to an ideal and see when we're not living up to that ideal, right? And it's we don't necessarily need to say, oh, that ideal um, is a prehension of God, but why not say that? And so we have this ideal comparison that we make. Um,
Yeah, but are we in this position? I mean, I don't want to flog a dead horse, but are we in this position where you just said, why not say that? That it's quite ad hoc in that case. So again, there is a function, there's a
yeah,
function.
the history of human religious experience is part of the cosmos, part of the data to be explained when we do cosmology, right? And so,
Oh, for sure. But I mean, I think there are I mean, there are, of course,
mhm.
very sort of, reductionisty, try to explain it away.
But there are culturally diverse ways that human beings have related to this
Yeah.
objective aim, let's call it. But even any soteriological spiritual tradition, whether it's aiming at um, the cessation of suffering and through letting go of all attachment, or whether it's aiming at union with God, it's another cultural way of rendering, I would say, what Whitehead's trying to describe in metaphysical terms as a prehension of this objective aim, and an attempt, though we inevitably fail to align our own subjective aim with that objective aim. Um, and the fact that we fail to do so is why, in some sense, even God fails to do so, because God remains incomplete as a creature of creativity, just like the rest of us. And so there's a sense in which God is not all powerful and is doing the best that God can, just as we're all doing the best that we can. But God has this unique advantage in Whitehead's scheme of, this consequent nature that never, God's concrescence never perishes, for Whitehead. And so the consequent nature is, yeah, receiving the value achieved by every actual occasion. And, Whitehead would say preserving that in objective immortality, um, but also allowing it to live in the subjective immediacy of God, which is only ever present. It's the eternal present. And admittedly, in part four of Process and Reality, we're shifting from metaphysics to mysticism, informed by metaphysics. And there are a lot of logical contradictions that we have to deal with, that, God transcends the world and the world transcends God. And, he has this whole list of coincident opposites in part five. And so, it's a matter of, yeah, that relationship between reason and, dare I say, revelation or mystical experience that can't quite be rationalized. But Whitehead will say later that philosophy is the attempt to rationalize mysticism. He says that.
Well,
Uh,
I mean, many would say that, and I think that there would be a historical basis for making that claim in the pre-Socratics, being descended from this tradition of sages and being very much on the cusp of that, and then of course, esoteric dimensions of Plato's philosophy and the notorious seventh letter and all of this. So the two have always been very wed to one another, and so I see that as as fine. And I'm certainly interested in the mystical aspects as well, but I think there are important distinctions to be made nonetheless. And I wonder um, if by bringing the term, and again, I'm flogging this dead horse. I'm feeling very unwell right now. Sorry,
Mm,
so I've become like completely
that's
non-compass.
okay. We'll wrap up soon because I'm exhausted as well.
Yeah, I'm happy to. I think we've been coming down with something for the last week, and just in the last sort of hour, it's been sort
Mm,
of hitting me. And obviously want to be always as lucid as possible for these conversations. But apologies to any listeners if it's noticeable that I kind of like um, have not been recently. But anyway, I'm still very obviously interested in pursuing these things. But so maybe it just enables me to say things in a much simpler way, or not try to say too many things. Um,
mm,
because I think we're just back in this similar position where, and maybe Hartshorne is actually giving us another good, like maybe like, certain people give an example of the way Whitehead's doctrines of eternal objects can be kind of extremized and turned into something that, say, you wouldn't want to endorse, and whether Whitehead would or not becomes very difficult to say. I mean, maybe the way Hartshorne treats the theological aspects here is another kind of example of that. Because I think it's really one thing to say that my God is a metaphysician's God, is not an object of worship and such things. But then to have, as you say, the transition into mysticism, directly after making those sorts of claims, um, and then, but even the very considered, traditional, but loaded decision to use the terms that Whitehead uses, um,
masculine pronoun, for example.
yeah, exactly. And capitals and all these things, it makes it very difficult for us not to, because again, I can appreciate the operations, and really I want to talk about that more specifically.
Right.
You and I always get into this um, concern over the terminology, but I really want to pursue the diagrammatic um, approach and really drill down on, what is the function of the primordial nature and the consequent nature here,
Yeah.
and can we think about those functions in the absence of the terminology, and then maybe though we can get more precise about where the terminology, or the word that's coming to me is not really the one I want to use, but I will anyway, has contaminated the diagram in the
Yeah.
sense that what has, and it's much the same as these sort of tacit assumptions that we're talking about, and pre-existing state spaces and certain infinites, tacit infinites and things, and tacit teloi, things that are sort of presupposed. And the question is, well, do we need those operationally?
Mm,
Um, or have they inevitably creeped into the system either because of, Whitehead's logicist background, or because of his theological desiderata, like his attempt, even though he's pursuing, cosmology and metaphysics to the hilt, and no one could ever fault him for how far he takes these things, obviously, and how systematic he is and all of that. But is he actually trying to do too many things by using terminology that he thinks is, just as we spoke at the beginning about, prehension is solving the problem of causation and affect simultaneously in some way. He's also trying to pacify um, the relationship between science and religion here. Like he's got so many goals. And again, I fully admire the attempt to achieve, and I think that they're important goals, but I wonder to what extent the individual goals are necessarily, deformed, or our capacity to pursue them is necessarily deformed by saying these are the same context. So, you and I've talked quite a bit recently, and many times, about obviously the difference between cosmology and metaphysics, but the different approaches to the speculative, which both cosmology and metaphysics in this sense are part of our approach to speculation and the speculative ontology, um, and a diagrammatic approach to that versus a mythopoetic approach. And where I'm really, leaning is it's not a matter of kind of disrespect or even a devaluing of the mythopoetic. At least that's never something that I want to be doing. And I do have a place for all of these things in my life. But I see that the speculative in a obviously, when we're speaking about the speculative here, we're kind of, implicitly speaking in this Persian sense. And so the Persian triad, and we've got, the prosaic world, like the world of lived experience. We've got the world of inquiry, which is essentially, science and mathematics and such things. And then the speculative, which is where we do our pursue our ontological project. What is the nature of reality given the natures of the prosaic and the inquiry, and so they're all interdependent, they're all linked together, and they have to be. But when we're trying to discretize them, say, as much as possible, when we're trying to pursue the speculative approach in as kind of pure, we should always mistrust purity, but in as pure a way as possible. It starts to look to me very much as though the function of the mythopoetic is always as a bridge between, say, the prosaic, so the world of lived experience, in which one might have a relationship with God, and of course in which one might be part of a religious community, and which one might find the natural world enchanting, and all of these, all of this stuff, and where spirituality is located, all of that. And the mythopoetic is, I think, very traditionally, even though people would not have explicitly put it in these terms, an attempt to articulate between all of those elements of lived experience and our sense of the cosmos, like the thing as a whole. And so when we have this slightly more modern, maybe, separation that we can make of the diagrammatic and the mythopoetic as two different ways of pursuing a project, which is, oriented towards describing the nature of things at the most general in the most general way possible. Um, it becomes to me the case that the mythopoetic is irrevocably personal, so it's irrevocably bound up in the prosaic. So the choice of terms one wants to make are going to be very personal there, and that we should sort of try and keep the diagrammatic, therefore, as separate from that as possible, because it will inevitably be, again, the operations, the relations, etc., that we're trying to identify and think as clearly as possible about will inevitably be obfuscated in some way by applying this, religious, theological, mythopoetic, etc., terminology to them. And so I
But
think
what
that's,
about
yeah, sorry.
what about the Jungian sense of the mythopoeic actually not being so personal, but being more about the collective unconscious?
But yes, no, but getting into a conversation of the ontology of the collective unconscious.
Right. I
This
mean, that's sort of a let me see if I can try to render what give you what
obviously a very collective. There's obviously, just to say that there's obviously a very collective element to it.
yeah.
Like it's not that the prosaic is this absolutely individual thing, but that's again where the collective and the personal are articulated, and there's a contingency. Say there is some archetypal, structure, and this comes back to eternal objects and these sorts of things, or but there is an archetypal set of possibilities, let's say, or there's a constraint of possibility space, and all humans have very similar experiences on some level, but they dress them up very differently in different garb. They describe them very differently, and there is a plurality of religious traditions. And we obviously want to be careful of a kind of naive perennialism, which just says, oh, well, they're all saying the same thing, so it doesn't really matter what terminology we use. And even this discussion of whether, for like Chinese Whiteheadians, the Tao is creativity or the Tao is God, is an interesting nuance there. The terms that are being used, though, the God with a capital G, that's not part of the collective unconscious. That's not archetypal so much as a specific image, which is more contingently historical.
Yeah.
Um,
No, it's an English word. Um, okay, let me see, and we'll wrap up in a few minutes. But in terms of what it would take to render Whitehead's process theology in terms of the operations being performed without using the loaded religious language.
The
So it's
worthwhile.
without, so let's talk about concrescence and the way in which we want to have concrescence exemplified as a an account of the process by which novelty is produced. We want to have it rendered macrocosmically as like this is the primary example of how concrescence occurs when we're talking about the whole shebang. And we also want it to apply microcosmically. And obviously, it's the same process of concrescence. We want the same categories to apply macrocosmically just as much as microcosmically. But there is one unique difference that Whitehead throws in here, which is to say um, the macrocosmic concrescence, the polarity is reversed because there's no history yet. So the mental pole comes first and the physical pole comes second, logically speaking. Whereas for microcosmic concrescences, physical pole comes first because every microcosmic concrescence is situated somewhere in spacetime and has to deal with that situation first before it explores alternatives in the mental pole. Whereas at the macroscopic level of concrescence, mental pole comes first. It's ahistorical in a sense, but it provides an initial shaping to the field of possibilities that is then immediately reshaped by every subsequent microscopic concrescence because those microscopic concrescences are in some sense taking place within that macroscopic concrescence. There's almost an analogy here between um, the way prehensions relate to a given actual occasion and the way that then actual occasions relate to the macrocosm or to God, if we just to slip back into the religious language for a second. And yet we want to grant these actual occasions a little bit more individuality than we usually would, the Whitehead would grant prehensions. Um, so I'm not trying to reduce actual occasions microscopic concrescences to the macroscopic concrescence because that macroscopic concrescence has to, in its physical pole, make room for everything that happens microcosmically, all the decisions, ongoing decisions that are being made by um, the microcosmic occasions. And so, but the real function here for the macrocosmic concrescence is to allow us to understand um, real potentiality and the real potentiality both of the past and of the future. So, in other words, where are the potentials? Um, where is the past right now? Well, you could say, well, the past is present in some sense as a set of real potentials for the present to inherit as data and process, make something of. But Whitehead's reference to um, the consequent nature or the physical pole of this macrocosmic concrescence is his attempt to give some account for uh, where the potentialities of the past are. They're now, but now in a sense that far exceeds my personal capacity to, keep in mind. I can't, as Bergson says and Hartshorne reiterates, the brain is more about forgetting than it is about remembering. The function of the brain is more to allow us to forget than to remember anything. So Bergson would totally dismiss the idea that there's some kind of a, material trace in the brain that can account for memory. It's like, no, memory is stored in the total environment, in the macrocosm. Similarly, with the future, that the real potentiality of the future is vague, whereas the real potentiality of the past is determinate without being determining of what happens in the present. And so similarly, the even though those possibilities of the future are vague, they're generic, Hartshorne says, and I think we could say generically definite to try to bridge with Whitehead a little bit. Not they're not particularly definite yet, those future possibilities. But again, the reason Whitehead makes reference to this macrocosmic concrescence or this divine um, entity or dipolar entity is to conform with his ontological principle that possibilities are not floating nowhere. They're in an actual entity, and that is the macrocosmic concrescence. So he's referencing that as a way of explaining the difference between the actualization in the present and the real potentiality, asymmetric potentiality of past and future. Um, and so that's my best attempt at right now after a very long day on Zoom to strip away all the religious terminology and try to use other more metaphysical terms that Whitehead also uses to describe what's going on operationally here.
Yeah, and I like it. What I think would be useful, I will respond, but given my current degree of lucidity, which is absolutely minimal,
Mm.
would be to have a transcript of what you've just said, and you can edit it and clear it up, and then I will write a response to it.
That's a
Uh,
good idea.
when I'm, also hopefully capable of at least I can think more slowly when I write anyway, even if I'm still sick. We've been well for a remarkably long period of time, actually, given our daughter being in daycare, and we've just started having the sniffles in this past week, and it's just yeah, I've got like a really sore throat and a headache and just feeling really quite unpleasant now. But I will still respond anyway, and people can choose to forgive me or not. Um, that's on you. But yeah, we should hash that out and develop that in a written document, because I think we can get a bit more precise. And I think there's so many things that we say to each other in our back and forth on WhatsApp all the time that I think it's quite different from the dynamic we have here as well, which is great to have different dynamics. But
Mm.
sometimes you can write something in a way that expresses the thing. But I think there are a bunch of possible aspects of that operational scheme that are just very open to kind of questioning. So I think one of the things is that if we think of a primordium, and even I'm going to say here creativity, as you know, co-actual virtual, so both actual and potential, um, because it would be meaningless at that point to distinguish between the two, because it's only when we have a kind of evolution of determinacy, and we have processes of actualization which are the coming into being of determinate actualized states, that you can then make that operational distinction between the actual and the virtual, the actual and potential.
Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
Michael Epperson was actually very good on this point in the he didn't say it in this way, but in the Timothy Eastman seminars that you had me rewatch a couple of in the last week or whenever that was. Um, so he sort of insisted on referring to psi, like to the wave function prior to any event, so to speak, as an actual state. And I think there's something important there, to think about if we are thinking in these sort of field-based terms, and we're thinking about this sort of tense more than a unity, pre-individual in a Simondonian sense, etc. There's or even like a kind of plane of immanence, in a Deleuzian sense. There isn't sufficient grist for us at that point to separate the potential and the virtual as like discrete operators. And so that might problematize the idea that the mental pole comes before the physical pole in the macroscopic situation. It's like when you're getting to the most general point, um, maybe they're just the same. It's just like I would say, and this I think you would agree with, and Whitehead would agree with, but when people want, like certain idealist people want to say, well, consciousness is the fundamental nature of reality, or of course materialists want to say matter. So to me, that's just both going to be wrong, and it's kind of a category error of a sort to take those sort of derived concepts and project them back on, like you should be deriving those concepts from something which is much more impoverished and denuded than either of them. And so I wonder how it's going to look if we say that the absolute primordium, again, to the extent this is a meaningful thing to talk about, but the most generic state that we could think of, the most impoverished state that we could think of is co-actual and co-virtual, co-actual virtual, the many one, all of that. And okay, so there's that. Then I think some of the other things, I mean, I've got notes here, which now my, my memory is so short they don't even make sense to me anymore, even though I wrote them 2 seconds ago. I mean, there's always this question of where is the past right now, and then there's also this question of where are the potentials, and I think that there are quite distinct ways of answering those questions, which I think don't necessarily require us to, you might object to me saying that it's a posit or a postulate, but to having this the divine function, right? And also, I guess there's the when we think about the macroscopic organism, um, is that really identifiable with God, or in the is that a panentheist view, or can it become a pantheist view? And um, could we escape determinism in the latter? And there are some other questions there, right? But um, if we have a notion of temporal scale, so things are changing on very different scales. So some things are stable across an entire cosmic epoch, and it's not like they go away. So it's not like, the set of relations that defines the standard model is hanging out in virtual space or something like that. It's like it's instantiated in every concrete actuality all the time. So it's always there. So we don't need an additional principle to say that it's somewhere else. Like, where is it? It's like it's here all the time. And
Right.
so that could apply to a lot of the things that last at the longest temporal scale. And like, just to be trivial about it in a sense, it's like, the glass is stable over a certain period of time. And so the past, which includes the manufacture of the glass, and the original, achievement of this fixed state, or the bitumen out there, or the whatever, the cars, like all the different objects that I'm looking at, have stability over. So they are instantiations of memory, because they are concrete instantiations of their entire history that are stable over some long period of time. And so a notion of temporal scale, which goes from like this epochal notion, really, that Whitehead very much has, right? But from the cosmic, from the 14 billion year stabilities to the, moment to moment, things that are the most ephemeral things that we can think of. You can do a lot with a notion like that can account for some of these questions of, like, where's the past, and all of that. Like, a lot of aspects of the past are just with us, and some just go away. But because of prehension, which I will accept, because there is in fact a relational continuity, so the prehension in its function of causation, um, the future is always derived from the past in any case. So even the things that do disappear, they have a certain kind of inertia with them, even though we should admit of the notion that some things disappear. Like many of them, like if you think about it again in kind of evolutionary terms, like biological terms, and we were thinking about these, rhizomatic complex networks at the synchronic level, but the sort of more denuded tree structure over longer periods of time. There are a lot of things that happen in the moment that are radically ephemeral, that, they don't echo in eternity, basically, right? Many things get lost. And, at the level of kind of the development evolution cusp in a biological lineage, the individual innovates a lot of things, does a lot of things that are not determined by the past, but are enabled and facilitated by it, in exactly the way that you were describing very nicely in Whitehead's scheme. Um, and only some pretty small subset, probably, of those things actually feeds back onto the lineage through whatever method of inheritance you care to name, whether it's, epigenetic stabilization, which will become, a stronger genetic form of transmission, whether it's cultural transmission, from me to my daughter, or of course, horizontal transmission, which is a very big deal in the kind of trans individual cultural space. Some things will last for a really long time, and some things will not, and some things will just disappear with that, will never be recoverable, right? So a lot of the past just disappears. But anyway, so this is just to
You
say,
disagree with
sorry.
Bergson. You disagree then with Bergson, Peirce, Whitehead, Hartshorne about the indestructibility of the past.
Yeah, I think I do. I mean, maybe I want to think about that more carefully, but yes, I don't think that everything. But I just think there are degrees of destructibility here, and so maybe as a kind of limit concept, there's the absolutely destroyed. But I think in so there's an in principle, in practice distinction here, maybe, and it might also be, somewhat analogous to, is it meaningful to speak about the nature of eternal objects? Um,
Yeah, I
you know,
mean, in practice, a lot of what's happened in the past, most of it is totally irrelevant, but or negatively prehended even. But in
yeah,
principle, The past is indestructible.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if I want to affirm that. I think that might be one of these strong metaphysical principles that is, I don't know. I'm going to have to think about that. Put that in your transcript and
Yeah.
let me have a think about it. But you know, yeah, this is something. I mean, I have thought about it to some degree, and I think I was more previously on the side of thinking that it, you know, the past is indestructible, but I don't know. I think we have to admit of degrees of stability, and that might you know suggest that there's a null degree, or there's not a null degree in the sense that everything has some ripple, but do some of those ripples just peter out and disappear? Well, in point of fact, in any dynamical system that we can look at, yes, they
Well,
do. So, so
enduring enduring
yeah,
bodies certainly disappear. Um, but
yeah,
the but you know, in terms of the distinction Hartshorne makes a big deal about making about the difference between um, changing things that can be destroyed versus concrete events which don't change. I mean, this is the thing with Whitehead's process ontology. Actually, actual entities, once they perish, um, don't
perish,
change.
perish into immortality.
Yeah.
Uh, And I think that I agree with that in a qualified way. I don't know if I like. I think I see the importance of that principle, but I don't know that I want to elevate it to the status of an absolute. I don't know. Maybe that's something. Yeah. Again, like maybe just right now I'm digging myself a hole, quite possibly. But the other thing. So if we admit of a notion of temporal scale, whether that that would not commit us to the idea that the past is destructible, but that might be a related notion. I think there's also all these phenomena of scale that we study in sort of complex system science, and ways of dealing with potentiality that again hinge on what I'm always saying is an operational distinction between the potential and the actual, or the virtual and the actual, that is not intrinsically a substantial distinction. And so there are all sorts of ways that we handle the existence of possibility in a biological context, in a physical context, which are not uh, again not predicated, like what is actual at one level could be functioning as virtual at another level. So this is like we've talked a number of times about sort of arbitrary variation in stochastic systems. So whether that's mutation or stochastic gene expression, or this can be generalized in a lot of different ways. Um, from one level, so if you were looking at the level of organization of a particular functional trait or a whole organism or something like that, this variation that is kind of adjacent to and envelops that organizational state, or is like surrounds it in some sense, is continually probing around it, is virtual in relation to that higher order level on, so it's noise in relation to that higher order level of description and organization. It's exploring a bunch of spaces that are adjacent to that thing that it may or may not move into, depending on what kind of subset of that variation becomes elicited by the environment, or whatever. The point being that there's all this stochastic behavior at all these different levels in, say, like a biological system or in a lot of physical systems. And some of that will be stabilized into, some of that will contribute to a novel state of affairs at the sort of higher level, or more macroscopic, let's say, level of description, and some of it will just shimmer and not be selected, not be stabilized, not be amplified, etc. So there's, I don't know if I need to render it with more concrete examples, like a colony of ants. I've given you this example before, but like a colony of ants doing a random walk across their environment because they're not currently foraging in a collective way, but they're looking for resources. They're in that mode, right? And obviously, as ant colonies exist in the wild, they're generally in some combination of organized and disorganized behavior. But if you take ants into the lab, and set them up a foraging experiment, their initial search pattern is quite clearly a random walk. They don't know, they've never been in this environment before. They don't know what's in it. They don't know where the resources are. But when one of them finds the sugar at the end of the maze and then starts going back towards the colony, it starts to leave a trail of pheromones. Every individual that it goes, it's fascinating to watch, even like tiny ants really up close. Every individual that it contacts with, it touches them in some complex, very fast way. It tells them there's a resource there, and over time, a novel macro state coalesces. An organized foraging behavior coalesces out of what was originally this random distribution. And the point is that the initial random distribution like contains within it the potential for many, many, many different macro realizations, that only one of which, or several of which, or whatever it is, and importantly, again, they don't pre-exist. The particular foraging pathway doesn't pre-exist its stabilization. It comes into definiteness in a gradual kind of evolutionary way. But again, it's predicated on the pre-existence of potential um, potential macro states, which are actually instantiated in some vague sense by the random movement of the ants. And that is a kind of very general, we could talk about the planarian example in this regard that we talked about earlier in this regard. There's a lot of ways that um, levels of organization can give you access to a kind of virtuality that is nonetheless an actuality at some other level of description of the system. This is what the whole kind of like hierarchical systems approach in system science in kind of gives you access to. And so the whole cosmos looks like that. And we could go through in detail and speak about all these different systems in that regard. And again, we don't want to elide the fact that there must be some initial distribution. We can't start from some sort of abject, nullity or unity. That's a problem. And it does correspond to what might be referred, like David Alpert, the philosopher of physics, would call the past hypothesis, although that refers to this spurious question, in my opinion, of why was the universe start in such a low entropy state? Well, I think there are lots of assumptions that lead us to making that kind of claim. But basically, when we are going to do some kind of evolutionary analysis, we're always going to have to start with a particular state. And again, that's why we're looking at this principle. Well, that's why I'm looking at this principle of impoverishment, like what is the minimal state? But I don't know if any of that, I guess I've said these things to you so many times that they're obviously deeply unconvincing. But what I would try to do in more detail in a written thing is say, okay, these are the operations that we want. Can we see what we can get without positing the sort of, again, I don't want to do away with the divine in some violent way or whatever, but how much of this can we get from a slightly different conception? Do we have, in philosophers who I deeply respect, like Bergson, Persson, and Whitehead, do we have a set of kind of assumptions that are partly predicated on them just having worked in a period where we didn't really have these kinds of accounts? We didn't have system science. We didn't have non-equilibrium. And again, not to say that there are so many mysteries still in those areas, right? Anyway,
Yeah.
no doubt I'm really waffling, but yeah.
I mean, so creativity is the universal of universals. In some sense, it's maximally abstract, but also there's nothing actual that isn't an example of creativity, right? And so as you're saying, we can't even distinguish really between actuality and potentiality when we're talking about creativity. And there's this, Whitehead calls this, he has this principle, the principle of relativity, which is every being is a potential for a becoming. Or in other words, actual occasions occur in causal independence of one another because of the finite speed of light, or you could just generalize it and say the finite speed of causality or the transmission of prehension. That's the principle of relativity, and what it suggests is there's this relativity between what's actual and what's potential, in this sense that, an actual occasion in its process of concrescence here is experiencing what's already been actualized and its past as determinate within its light cone, but any actual occasions occurring um, simultaneously with it or occurring independently of it. And for this actual occasion here, that actual occasion is just a potential. Um, Whereas from that actual occasion's perspective, this one's a potential, even though it's, actualizing. And so what's actual and what's potential depends, it's relative to one's perspective, in a radical sense, even though um, there is an ontological difference between the real potentiality of the past and the real potentiality of the future. There's an asymmetry here. And it's, I admit, quite difficult to think about the multiple time systems at play in our relativistic um, cosmos, um, whereby, like, the very order of events can be different depending on the perspective of the occasion. Um,
But it's such a micro scale that that would not show up in our experience.
right.
Uh, and I think, again, we discussed this, again, you and I privately, uh, but I think that that holds analogically with even these much more macro scale and temporally macro um, examples like I'm giving in terms of the fact that a lot of what's innovated by the so when you think of an evolutionary lineage, at the pointy end, it's all of these different innovations that individuals are having. But again, if you looked at that further in the future, it would have kind of reconverged because most of I mean, to the extent that it actually remained the same species, there's always going to be inherent variation at any given time slice. But basically, you're going to see this constant at different timescales, divergence and convergence. And
Because
so
we
I think
share a wider environmental context, basically,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So I think I mean that and mechanisms of inheritance and some yeah again but I think so that the existence of temporal scales also speaks to that and the you can think about sparse coupling amongst actual occasions or something like that along these lines. Like you're only receiving some of the information about anything that you are separated from by some boundary, right? So anything that you're discrete from at some scale of analysis, these are all going to be very scale-free principles, but scale relative in their particular concrete manifestations. Um, you need to have a principle by which things are separated from one another. And Whitehead obviously this is again Hartshorne credits him with having this that Bergson and Peirce don't have. But again, I would say that this discreteness continuity thing, which we've talked about before, and you've talked about Alan Watts in this regard, it's a scale dependent phenomenon. So, what looks discrete at one scale, will look continuous at other scales and vice versa. And I like a thesis where a certain continuity obviously is sort of quasi-fundamental because again, everywhere I look in science, there is a kind of continuous thing that subtends some discrete manifestation, right? And the logic of actualization works for me better when you've got a discrete, a sort of a continuous set of variables that are then being discretized and particularized and I think that does fit quantum mechanics as well, even though Hartshorne will, I think, even reference here, the quantum nature of quantum mechanics, but that is the consequence of the measurement. That is the consequence of the this very controversial area of thought. I think some of the approaches which are trying to get really down into the guts there anyway might frame it that way. Not everybody would, obviously. Um,
Yeah. Well, we should talk about the unitarity, non-unitarity thing in quantum physics, continuity, discontinuity in terms of how actualization interacts um, wave function as a, continuous unitary process, but let's save that for another time because I can't possibly do that heavy lifting right now.
Yeah, yeah. I will only say on that with reference to your recent conversation with Ruth, which I enjoyed a lot with Ruth Kastner, what I want there will be a vision where non-unitarity applies very much to the space of the landscape of possibility as well, right? It can't just be so when I say that there's continuity, I don't just mean that there's this, you know, the the only absolutely continuous thing in some sense is possibility as completely disconnected from any actuality, which again, I don't think is something we can really think about.
Right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
we better stop. Yeah.
That was 3 hours of really intense metaphysics, and
I hope,
hopefully
yeah,
it
I
made
hope I
some
was,
sense.
yeah, I hope I was more or less coherent for most of it because, yeah,
Mm. But I will get the transcript and work this up, and we'll continue to hack away at it because obviously the oral form of philosophizing is valuable and new insights can come, but the written form allows for, I think, a heightened degree of precision and coherence because we can sort of keep multiple things in mind. Uh,
yeah. And I think as it pertains to particularly this issue that we're always returning to, regarding my concerns and about Whitehead and this diagrammatic approach, and I think we've as you've said many times, we've come a long way to sort of meeting each other in the middle. But I think that's the precise issue to drill down on in a written exchange. Um, and obviously we're writing this thing on the frame problem. I think it will feed back onto that as well, because I mean part of what we might want to give there is an account of the operational schema, shorn of some of the theological commitments.
yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
yeah.
All right, Tim. I hope you don't get terribly sick. Um,
Thank
and
you.
yeah, we'll reconvene next week and figure out, I don't know where we're going next. I forget, but
Maybe let's do fortnight in a fortnight.
sure.
Um, and yeah, I don't know exactly where either, but we'll work it out for sure.
All right. Sounds good. I'm gonna have some dinner. Feed
Do
Philo,
it.
who I've been nervous is gonna scratch me in the back because he's hungry. I've been
Okay.
tracked. You see me looking over to the side, it's because I'm tracking him. Because when he gets,
Sorry, Philo.
he'll be fine. He's well fed. Don't worry.
Yeah.
All right,
Take
Tim.
care.
Talk to you soon.